He died in the casino parking lot. And he woke up on an icy marble floor in a hall the size of an opera house beneath 2 moons. The tables are made of silver. They glow and hum, and someone has fastened a tag to his wrist with the word "debtor" on it. Dan Carrera pulls his cheek away from the icy stone and sits up. His head is spinning. The air smells of wax and burnt copper. Hundreds of voices are humming all around him. He glances down at his left wrist and sees a leather cord with a wooden tag. He doesn't recognize the symbols, but for some reason, he can read it. Debtor. He looks around the hall and realizes he's gone mad, or dead, or all of the above. 3 tiers, velvet railings, gas lamps burn with a greenish light, and the glow makes everything look underwater. In the center is a round table with 8 seats. A translucent sphere the size of a basketball hangs above the table. Numbers float inside it, and silver cards lie face up, humming like a transformer box behind the casino wall. Dan looks at his hands. Someone else's calluses. Someone else's fingers, younger than his own. No scar on the index finger. His body, but not his. He clenches his fists and unclenches them. His fingers obey. That's the only good thing. All right, there's magic. There are cards. He's not in Vegas. Panic doesn't help. It never has. A man in a red robe with a silver clasp at his throat is already walking toward him. His face wears an expression Dan has seen 1,000 times over the past 6 years. The irritation of a shift manager whose janitor has gone missing. The manager looms over him and barks. What the hell is he doing on the floor, and why isn't he at his post? Dan understands every word. His place is at the far table. Deal cards, wait on customers, clear away glasses. Dan stands up. He adjusts his collar. He straightens up. And he smiles that same even, cold smile he's used for 6 years to greet overconfident high rollers. Not a trace of fear. The floor manager blinks. He steps back. Then, with a nod, he shoos him to the far end of the hall. Dan walks and counts. Not the cards, the exits for now. 3 doors. One behind the stage on the right, one on the upper tier to the left. The main one with carved doors behind him. Then he counts the people. Dozens at the tables, hundreds in the tiers. A ring glitters on every player's finger. Bronze, copper, silver. The 2 at the main table are wearing black metal rings. The crowd is glued to the game, just as the crowd in Vegas is glued to the final table of the World Series of Poker. Eagerly, silently, holding their breath. The dealer shuffles him over to a small table in the corner. 2 middle-aged, sweaty players sit across from each other. Between them lies a deck of silver cards and 2 glasses of dark liquor. A scroll lies nearby on the velvet. Deal. The dealer walks away. Dan looks at the deck. He doesn't know the rules. He doesn't know the suits. He doesn't know what the symbols on the backs mean. But cards are cards. They have numbers, order, mathematics. And mathematics is the same in any universe. He sits down on a stool between the players and picks up the deck. The cards are cold, smooth, and vibrate slightly in his fingers, as if they were alive. The first player is stockier, red-faced, a ring with a green stone on his right hand. He slumps in his chair and taps the ring against the edge of the table. Tap, tap, tap. The second is thinner, pale, nervous. He licks his lips every couple of seconds. Dan reads the gist from the scroll. A business dispute over a share in a shop, small potatoes by the standards of this hall. Dan deals the cards. Silver clinks softly against the table, and he watches. He always watches. 6 years in the observation room have taught him one thing. The sound is off. The camera is silent. Only the hands remain. Shoulders. Neck. The fat one takes a card without looking and places it face up in the row. Tap, tap with his ring. The skinny one watches. He licks his lips. He places a coin. The fat one smirks and doubles the bet. Tap, tap. Dan deals another round. The skinny guy looks again and licks his lips. The fat guy places his bet again without looking and taps. Tap. Tap, tap. And then something clicks inside Dan. On the outside, he deals with the same impassive expression, but he's seen this rhythm before. 3 years ago. Table number 17, blackjack. 2 of them were working as a team. One tapped his chip against the armrest. 1 tap meant pass. 2 taps meant take. A long pause, then a tap for all in. Back then, 15 minutes on the monitor was enough for him. Now, 2 hands are enough. The fat guy taps not just for the sake of it. He's sending a signal. Not to the skinny guy, to someone in the balcony. Dan turns his head slightly. On the lower tier behind the skinny guy sits a young man of about 20. He's reading the victim's cards over his shoulder, and after each tap from the fat guy, moves his foot forward or backward. The skinny guy doesn't see this. The fat guy sees it perfectly. It's a classic scheme. The observer reads the cards. He passes the information to his partner. The partner plays it safe. In Vegas, they'd escort you out the back door and blacklist you for that. Here, apparently, it's different. Dan can't accuse the fat guy. He doesn't know the rules. He doesn't know who to complain to. He doesn't even know the name of the city. But he knows how to throw off the rhythm. On the next hand, he places the card in front of the skinny guy a little slower, and with his elbow, he nudges the coin toward the edge. The coin falls and clinks. Precisely. Right at the moment when the fat guy is about to tap. The fat guy loses his rhythm. He taps at the wrong time. The kid in the gallery swings his leg out of sync. For the first time in the game, the skinny guy makes a move of his own choosing. He places a water card on a fire card, and both flare up with white light. The skinny guy flinches. Then he smiles. He played it right, without even realizing it. Dan picks up the coin and puts it back. No one notices. And with every hand, he does the same thing. He changes the rhythm slightly. He coughs at just the right moment. He drops his gaze to the floor when the fat guy catches his eye. He shifts the deck by 1/2 centimeter. All minor details, all imperceptible. But every micro-glitch breaks the signal chain between the fat man and the observer. 1/2 hour later, the thin man wins. He doesn't understand how it happened himself. The fat man's face darkens, but he remains silent. Both sign the scroll. The overseer takes the deck and leaves. The thin man grabs Dan by the sleeve right at the door. He stares at him for a long time. He asks who he is. Dan shrugs and says he was just dealing the cards, and that the merchant has a very uncomfortable ring. It jingles. The thin man looks at him for another second. Then he slips a gold ring with a small stone off his little finger and places it in Dan's palm. The ring is warm. Dan clenches it in his fist. Gold. Real gold. His first bankroll. He walks out the front door onto the street. It's night. The cobblestones are wet from the rain. The air smells of fish and smoke. 2 moons shine overhead, a large white one and a small reddish one. There's a sign above the door, and he reads it in its entirety. The Silver Carp, the free city of Andvale. He looks at the ring, then at the tag. Debtor. Someone pulled him out of the world where he died in the parking lot and tossed him onto the marble floor, where disputes are settled with silver cards. Why? He doesn't know yet, but he knows something else. They play games here, which means they count here, and he knows how to count. Dan spent the night on a bench against the wall behind the hall, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he didn't know where to go. The streets of Andvale were narrow and winding. The houses stood close together. The dark tiled roofs glistened in the rain. The gas lamps burned with the same greenish light as inside the hall. People walked in groups of 2 or 3. Some wore robes. Some wore plain jackets. Almost all of them had rings on their fingers, of different colors and sizes. Dan sat and watched. That was the only thing he knew how to do right now. Watch and remember. By morning, he had figured out a few things. First, the rings indicated rank. Bronze was the lowest, silver was higher, black was the highest. This was obvious from the way people parted for them. A man with a black ring walked down the middle of the street, and the crowd flowed around him like water around a rock. Second thing, the city never slept. The halls were open all night. Third thing, the wooden tag on his wrist was a problem. Patrolmen in leather vests passed by twice, and both times they looked at the tag. The first time they walked right past him. The second time, one of them stopped and asked which house this debtor was registered to. Dan said he didn't remember. The patrolman looked at him as if he were drunk and moved on. But Dan remembered that look. The tag signified status, the lowest status. A debtor, a man who had and hasn't paid it back yet. People like that weren't respected here. When dawn broke, he went looking for a place to stay. He sold the merchant's gold ring at a money changer's shop 2 blocks from the hall. The money changer was an old woman with trembling hands and very piercing eyes. She turned the ring over in her hands for a long time. Then she named a price. Dan didn't know if it was a lot or a little, but from the way she named the number, he knew it was too little. Too quickly, too confidently, without a pause. In Vegas, when someone names a price without a pause, it means they're pocketing the difference. Dan shook his head and asked for 1.5 times that amount. The money changer looked at him with a new expression. Then she nodded. He received the money in small silver coins. It was enough for a room above the bakery in the Harbor District. Small. A bed, a table, a chair, a window overlooking the courtyard. The smell of bread wafted up from below. Dan sat down at the table and placed a wooden tag in front of him, one he'd taken off his wrist. Debtor. The word wasn't written in letters, but in symbols. He understood them, just like everything else in this language. He'd heard it, read it, thought in it, as if he'd always known it. It was convenient, and it was frightening. Someone hadn't just dumped him here. Someone had prepared him. The language. The ability to understand speech. Even the body wasn't entirely foreign. It was his height, his shoulder width, but younger, lighter, without the marks of 6 years of sedentary work. He clenched and unclenched his left hand. There was no tremor. Not yet, anyway. He left the room and walked back to the hall, not to play, just to watch. The silver carp looked different in the daytime. Without the greenish light and the noise of the crowd, it was just a large room with high ceilings. The tables stood empty. The decks of cards had been put away. Only at the far wall, behind the bar, was a bartender working and wiping glasses. And one more person. A woman. She was sitting on the edge of a low stage, singing softly. Her voice was low and hoarse. She was singing something simple. The melody was like a lullaby, but the words were about a river and a boat that never returned. Dan stopped at the door. She was beautiful. Not like the women in Vegas, where beauty is a business and every gesture is calculated. She was beautiful in a different way, like someone who had long since stopped thinking about how she looked. Her dark hair was tied in a bun at the nape of her neck. A simple gray dress, bare feet on the wooden floor of the stage. She also had a tag on her left wrist. Dan could see it from where he stood. A thin cord and a wooden tag, just like his. A debtor. She finished the song and saw him. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She just looked straight ahead, calmly, like someone who had nothing left to lose. She asked if the hall was closed until evening. Dan said he knew, that he'd been dealing cards here yesterday. She nodded and said she'd seen him, the new guy, the one who dropped a coin. Dan's eyebrow twitched slightly. She noticed it. From the audience, from the stage, while she was singing, she noticed a single coin fall in the corner. This woman had very kind eyes. She said her name was Lyra Vane. Dan told her his name. She asked which house he was from. He said none. She looked at his name tag and said nothing. Then she asked if he knew how to play. Dan replied that he was learning. Lyra jumped down from the stage and walked over to the nearest table. She pulled a deck of cards from under the counter. Not a silver one, a copper one, a practice deck. And she began laying the cards out on the table, face up. 52 cards. 4 suits: fire, water, mirror, silence. Each suit had 10 numbered cards from 1 to 10 and 3 face cards: master, keeper, herald. Dan watched. He memorized them. Not just the cards, he memorized the symbols on them. Fire looked like a curling tongue of flame, the very one he'd seen yesterday. Water was a wave inside a circle. Mirror was 2 identical triangles pointing toward each other. Silence was an empty circle, just an outline with nothing inside. Each card carried an elemental resonance. Lyra explained it simply. When you place a fire card on the table, it burns. Not for real, but the next card after it receives heat. If the heat matches the suit of the next card, it intensifies. If it doesn't match, it weakens. The mirror copies the opponent's last played card. Silence prohibits bluffing for 1 turn. Memory is a special card. There's only 1 in the deck. It allows you to see one of your opponent's discards. Dan listened and built a model. Not a complete one, not yet anyway, but there were already variables. 52 cards, 4 elemental states, interactions between suits, the influence of the previous card on the next one. It was more complicated than poker. But it was a system, and any system is governed by numbers. Lyra showed him a basic game. 2 players, 7 cards in hand each. The goal is to score 100 points or reduce the opponent's score to 0. Players take turns. Bets are placed between turns. The game is over when one of the players concedes or when the deck is empty. Dan asked how much information a player has about their opponent's hand. Lyra said none, only what's on the table, and what you've memorized from the discard pile. Dan nodded. Incomplete information. Just like in poker. Just like in any card game. He asked what happens when a player loses. Lyra said that the loser signs a scroll. Losing is the law. You can't refuse. You can't appeal. The cards of consent decide everything. Dan asked, "What if the bet is a person?" Lyra fell silent. Then she said that it happens sometimes. It's called a person-for-person bet, when one player bets another person's debt token. If they lose, that person becomes the winner's property, like an asset. Dan asked, "Is that slavery?" Lyra said no. Officially, no. Officially, it's a debt, one that can be worked off. But everyone knows you can't actually work it off because the winner sets the terms of repayment. She spoke in an even tone, without emotion, like someone explaining the rules of a game they'd lost long ago. Dan looked at her token. He asked who held her debt. Lyra gathered the cards back into a deck and placed them on the counter. She said it was a man named Goran Tess, the owner of 3 shops and 2 warehouses in the Harbor District. He'd won her token from the hall's former owner 2 years ago. Now she sings here every evening, and half of what she's tipped goes to Goran. And in 4 months, Goran plans to put her token up for a per-person bet. She said this just as matter-of-factly, like a schedule. Dan was silent. Then he asked why she was telling him all this. Lyra looked at him and smiled for the first time during the entire conversation, briefly, crookedly, with just one corner of her mouth. And she said it was because yesterday, for the first time in 3 years, he was the only one at that table who did something not for himself. She saw it. She saw everything from the stage, and the coin, and the ring, and how the fat man had turned pale when his rhythm faltered. She said she wasn't asking for help, but if he was really learning to play, it would be to her advantage to have someone nearby who knew how to count, and it would be to his advantage to have someone nearby who knew the rules. Dan stood there looking at her. Numbers were already spinning in his head. 4 months, 52 cards, 1 creditor. He held out his hand. Lyra shook it. Her hand was dry and strong, the hand of someone used to holding their own. For the next 3 days, Dan didn't play. He sat in the hall every evening on the lower tier and watched. Lyra had arranged a spot for him by the wall behind a column, from where he could see 2 tables. He arrived at opening time and left after closing. The bartender started pouring him tea without being asked. Dan watched the players' hands, the cards, the sphere above the table that reacted to every card laid down with a soft flash. He memorized everything. Over the course of 3 evenings, he watched 46 hands. In 32 of them, he could predict the outcome by the middle of the game. Not because he knew magic, but because he saw patterns. A player with a weak hand licks his lips. A player with a strong hand slows down. Someone about to bluff raises their shoulders slightly. Someone confident of victory relaxes their neck. Everything was exactly the same as in Vegas. Bodies don't lie, in any universe. Magic added complexity, but not as much as he'd feared. The elemental echoes obeyed their own logic, and that logic was consistent. A fire card strengthened the next fire card and weakened a water card. The mirror copied the opponent's last card, but only if it was a number. The mirror didn't work on faces. Silence nullified a bluff for that turn, which meant that after a silence, the opponent was obligated to play honestly. Only numerical values, no tricks. Memory revealed one of the opponent's discarded cards, and this was powerful because the discard pile in Cartana isn't just a dumping ground, it's a source of information. Dan kept track of everything in his head: tables, correlations, probabilities. By the 3rd evening, he could name, with his eyes closed, the probability that an opponent held a set of 3 mirror cards, provided that 2 mirror cards were already on the table and 1 was in his own discard pile. 14.3%. The local arbiters didn't calculate that way. They didn't calculate at all. They felt. They talked about intuition and the will of the goddess and the flow of the elements. Dan looked at them and saw people playing by feel in a room where they could turn on the light. On the 4th day, he sat down at the table. His opponent was a regular at the hall named Kelm, an elderly man with a bronze ring. He played every evening for small stakes. The bet was 10 silver coins, a small sum. Dan could afford to lose it. That was important. He never sat down at a table with money he couldn't afford to lose. He learned that rule in Vegas during his very first year. Bankroll management, the absolute basics. The hand lasted 20 minutes. Kelm played predictably. He loved high-value cards and always stepped up his attack instead of building a defense. Dan played cautiously. He played his weak cards first. He figured they'd end up in the discard pile. He waited. By the middle of the game, he had a complete picture of Kelm's hand. Not down to the exact card, but good enough. Kelm was holding 2 fire cards, 1 face-up, a master, and something from silence. Dan could tell this not from the cards themselves, but from the way Kelm looked at them. When he looked at the left side of his hand, his pupils dilated slightly. Fire. Power. When he looked at the right side, he frowned slightly. Silence. which he didn't like. On the final move, Dan played the mirror. Kelm played the fire master. The mirror copied the master. Two masters of fire on the table dealt a double blow. The sphere flared red. Kelm lost 20 points at once and dropped to 0. The game was over. 10 silver coins. Kelm grunted and signed the scroll. Then he patted Dan on the shoulder and said he hadn't lost so cleanly in a long time. Dan played his second game the following evening, against a young man with a copper ring. 20 silver coins. He won in 15 minutes. He played the third game the day after that, against a middle-aged woman with a stern gaze and a habit of laying her cards down with a click. She was better than Kelma. She kept track of the discards. Not the way Dan did, but she kept track. The game lasted 40 minutes. Dan won, but barely. 3 wins, a profit of 50 silver pieces. His bankroll was growing. Slowly, but it was growing. On the 7th day, he deliberately lost. That was the most important thing he did during his first week. His opponent was a young grain merchant with a self-assured smile. The stake was 15 silver coins. Dan could have won. He saw it by the 4th move. But instead, he started making mistakes. Small ones. Plausible ones. He played fire after water. He didn't use the silence when it was to his advantage. He lost 12 points for no reason and ultimately threw away the game. The young merchant stood up with the air of a victor. He slammed his hand on the table. He ordered wine. Dan paid 15 silver pieces and left. Lyra was waiting for him at the back entrance. She'd seen everything. She asked why. Dan explained. 3 wins in a row attract attention. 1 loss after 3 wins makes you just another player who got lucky. Ordinary players go unnoticed. They aren't remembered. They aren't considered a threat. In Vegas, this is called a card counter's disguise. You win when you need to. You lose when it's advantageous. Lyra was silent. Then she said she didn't like it. Dan replied that neither did he. But in a world where a loser signs a scroll, drawing attention before it's time is suicide. She didn't argue. She just nodded and walked back toward the stage. Her voice that evening sounded a little quieter than usual. On the 9th day, a man sat down at the table where Dan was watching yet another game. Short, thin, in an unremarkable gray coat, a silver-colored ring on his finger. A silver ring. A rank higher than bronze. Significantly higher. The man sat down next to him and silently watched the same game as Dan. 10 minutes later, he said quietly that the player on the left would lose in 3 moves. Dan didn't turn around. He replied that it would be in 4, not 3, because the player on the left was about to play silence, and that would give him 1 extra move. The man in gray tilted his head slightly. They both watched in silence. The player on the left played silence and lost in 4 moves, just as Dan had said. The man turned to him. He introduced himself. His name was Rennert. He said he worked as an observer for the local Andwale Guild of Arbiters, that he'd noticed a new player with 3 wins and 1 loss, and that he was interested. Dan looked at him closely. An observer from the guild. On the 9th day. Quick, faster than he'd expected. The planned loss was supposed to buy him more time. It didn't. So someone in the hall had already passed the information up the chain. So he'd been under surveillance sooner than he'd thought. Dan smiled, very quickly, calmly, and said he was curious too, because the player on the left had an interesting story about a discard on his penultimate turn, and he'd be happy to discuss it with someone who knew what they were talking about. Renard raised an eyebrow slightly. They stayed until the hall closed. Dan spoke little. He listened a lot. Renard was the type who loved to explain things. 2 hours later, Dan knew more about the Andwale Guild than he could have learned on his own in a month. 32 arbiters, 9 with silver rings, none with black ones. The last black-ringed arbitrator had left for Velmore 3 years ago. The guild was weakening. There were few young players. Good ones were even fewer. Renart said this with a bitterness he made no attempt to hide. Dan listened. He memorized. He calculated. 2 weeks later, Dan knew the Andwale deck better than most bronze arbiters. Not because he was a genius, but because he calculated. Every morning before heading to the hall, he would sit down at the table in his room above the bakery and lay out the copper practice deck. Lyra had lent it to him for an indefinite period. He played against himself, left hand against right. He'd run through combinations. He'd memorize tables of conditional probabilities. If I have 3 fire cards and there's a mirror on the table, if my opponent has discarded 2 messengers and I know there are 11 cards left in the deck, if silence has already been played twice and the third one can only be in his hand or in the deck, numbers, always numbers. Lyra would sometimes stop by in the morning. She'd bring bread from the bakery downstairs. She'd sit on the edge of the bed and watch him lay out the cards. Once, she asked how he could play against himself without cheating. Dan replied that the point wasn't to win, but to see all the possibilities. She thought for a moment and said that was the strangest thing she'd ever heard about gambling. Then she laughed, loudly. Louder than a woman with a debtor tag should in a room the size of a pantry. Her laugh was hoarse and warm. Dan found that he liked the sound of it. His bankroll was growing, slowly but steadily. He played every other day. He alternated between wins and losses. He kept his bets small, never more than 20 silver pieces. He lost enough to be considered an average player with mixed luck. By the end of the second week, he had 170 silver pieces. It was a sum that would allow him to take a step forward. But not yet. Goran Tess. That was the name of Lyra's creditor. Dan began gathering information about him, not by asking directly, but simply by listening. There was a lot of talk in the hall. The regulars gossiped over their drinks after losing. The bartender knew everyone. Lyra shared what she knew. Goran Tess was one of those people Dan knew well from his time in Vegas. Not a gambler, a businessman. A man who makes his money not at the table, but off those sitting at it. 3 shops, 2 warehouses, shares in 4 gambling halls, including the Silver Carp. Goran didn't play himself. He hired players, or he bought up debt notes and put them into games as chips. Human chips. Lyra was one of them. Her sister was another. 3 years ago, Goran put Lyra's sister's debt note into a game against someone from the Port Guild. He lost. Lyra's sister went to the winner. Goran didn't say who the winner was or where he was, because he wasn't obligated to. The law didn't require it. The cards had decided. Lyra had been singing and paying ever since. And deep in her eyes lived something Dan recognized. Not despair. Despair looks different. It was patience, dark and endless. The patience of a person who waits for an opportunity, but doesn't believe it will come. Dan wanted to help her. It was irrational. It was the first irrational decision he'd made in this world, and he knew it. 4 months. That's how long it would be before Goran put Lyra's tag into play. He had to make it in time. But first, he had to get stronger. Renart showed up in the hall every 3 days. They sat side by side and watched the matches. Renart provided commentary. Dan listened and asked questions that made Renart fall silent for a few seconds. Once, Dan asked whether the order of discards affected the probability of certain elements remaining in the deck. Renart looked at him very intently and said he'd never thought about it. Of course it does, but nobody counts it. Dan said he does. Renart was silent for a minute. Then he said that the guild would soon be holding an exam for the bronze ring and that he could recommend Dan. Dan asked what the bronze ring entailed. Renard explained. The right to play official matches, not those petty skirmishes at the tables in the Silver Carp, real ones, endorsed by the guild, with witnesses, with the right to appeal in case of cheating. A bronze ring is a pass to a game that counts. Dan said he'd think about it. Renard left. Dan thought about it for exactly 1 minute. The bronze ring offered something else as well: status. A person with an arbiter's ring isn't a debtor with a wooden tag. He's a player. His word carries weight at the table. He can challenge others to a game, and he can be challenged. But he can't be used as a betting chip. An arbiter isn't property. An arbiter is a person. If he gets the ring, he'll be able to sit down at the table against Goron Tess and bet his own money against Lyra's tag, officially, by the rules, with the guild's backing. He walked over to Lyra. She was in the hall's kitchen, peeling turnips. The cook had given her a knife and 3 buckets of vegetables. She was cutting quickly and precisely. Dan said he was going to take the exam for the bronze ring. Lyra stopped cutting. She looked at him. He said that later he was going to challenge Goron Tess to a game for her token. Lyra set the knife down on the table. Slowly. She said he was crazy. That Goron never plays alone. That he'd send a hired player. And that Goron's hired player was a man with a silver ring named Velis, who hadn't lost a game in the Dockside District in 5 years. Dan asked what she knew about Velis. Lyra knew a little. Tall, calm, plays in silence, likes long games. He wears down his opponent and strikes at the end. Dan nodded. A grinding style. Good. He'd seen that before. In Vegas, there was a poker player from Florida who played exactly the same way. 4 hours of silence, and then 1 decisive blow. He lost to those who could calculate faster than he could. Dan told Lyra he needed information. Every hand of Velis's that she'd seen or heard about. Every detail. What cards he likes, which suits he prefers, how he bets, when he bluffs, how he sits when he has a strong hand, and how he sits when he has a weak one. Everything. Lyra looked at him for a long time. Then she took the knife back and continued cutting the turnip. And she began to tell him. The exam for the bronze ring was in 10 days. 3 stages. First, theory, knowledge of the deck, rules, elemental interactions. Second, practical, a match against the examiner for points with no stakes. You had to score at least 60 out of 100 points. Third, ethics, an oral question from the senior arbiter about what makes a match fair. The theory didn't scare him. Dan knew the deck by heart. The practical part too. He played every day and won more than he lost, even with intentional losses. Ethics. That was more interesting. What makes a game fair? Dan had been thinking about it all night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling. In Vegas, fairness means the house has an edge and everyone knows it. The rules are out in the open. The math is transparent. The loser knows he lost not because he was cheated, but because that's how the numbers work. Here, it was different. Here, the math was hidden. The players didn't count. They believed. In luck. In the goddess. In the elements. And whoever knew how to count had an edge that no one could see. Just like the casino. Only the casino was Dan. That thought was uncomfortable. He rolled onto his side. A wooden tag lay on the table. Debtor. Who's someone's ancient debt. The one that had drawn him here. He closed his eyes and began counting sheep. Then he stopped and started calculating the probability of a mirror card on the 6th turn with 3 known discards. He fell asleep on the 3rd variable. The exam took place in the Andwheel Guild building, an old stone house on a hill above the harbor. Inside, it smelled of dust and old wood. The corridors were narrow. Portraits of arbiters from past decades hung on the walls. The rings on their painted fingers glinted with real metal fused into the paint. Renard had brought Dan there. He himself stood to the side as a guarantor. There were 3 examinees: Dan, a young woman with short-cropped hair and angry eyes, and a young man of about 19 whose hands couldn't sit still. The first stage, theory. A senior arbiter named Olvin sat at a table and asked questions. Name all 4 elements and their basic interactions. List the 3 faces and their special properties. Describe the memory effect and the mirror's limitations when encountering face cards. Dan answered smoothly, without hesitation. Olvin nodded. The young woman also answered without any mistakes. The young man stumbled on the mirror limitations. Olvin gave him a second chance. The young man answered correctly on the second try. All 3 passed. Stage 2, practice. A game against the examiner. The examiner was a middle-aged woman wearing a silver ring. She was silent. Her back was straight, and her hands moved precisely, without any unnecessary gestures. Dan sat across from her. The deck lay between them. Silver. Real. Not a copper training deck. It was the first time he'd held a real deck of consent cards in his hands. The cards were thin and cool. The hum was stronger than that of the copper ones. Each card pulsed. Not in his hands, somewhere inside, as if each one had its own pulse. He dealt the cards, 7 for himself, 7 for the examiner. He looked at his hand. 3 fires, 1 mirror, 1 water keeper, 2 silences. An average hand, not strong, not a total failure. He assessed it. 3 fires are good for aggression, but bad for defense. A mirror is only useful if the examiner plays face cards. 2 silences are too many. 1 silence is good. 2 in a row slow down the pace, so he needs to discard 1 silence early. Let the examiner think he's weak on silence, then use the second silence at a key moment. The examiner made the first move. Herald of Fire, an aggressive start, a face-up card, a powerful blow. Dan lost 8 points at once. The sphere above the table flashed red. He didn't flinch. 8 points, normal, as expected. He responded with a weak card, a 2 of silence, the weakest card in the suit. 2 points on the table. Nothing. Emptiness. The examiner's expression didn't change, but her fingers lingered slightly on the next card. For half a second, Dan saw it. She was surprised, not by the card, by the fact that he hadn't responded to her strike with a strike of his own. She became curious. An interesting opponent plays longer, plays more riskily, reveals himself. That was exactly what Dan wanted. The next 5 moves were slow. Dan played defensively, low cards, minimal bets. He gave up points, 10, 15. The score was 47 for the examiner and 62 for Dan. He was losing. There was no audience, just Olvin in the corner and 2 other examinees. But Dan played as if the room were full. Because he wasn't playing against the examiner, he was playing against himself. Against the tremor in his left hand that began to stir when the score wasn't in his favor. He breathed steadily. He kept count. On the 7th turn, the examiner played the Master of Mirrors, the strongest card. The master copied not 1, but 2 of his opponent's most recent cards. It was a 20-point blow. Dan was about to lose everything he'd earned. But instead of panicking, he placed his second silence on the table. Silence cancels out the effect of the previous card. The Mirror Master copied the silence. He scored 0. 20 points turned into nothing. The examiner blinked. Olvin in the corner leaned forward. Dan didn't smile. He knew this move was possible. He'd calculated it the moment he saw the Mirror Master on the list of cards. Silence wasn't a weapon. It was a shield. And if he saved it for the right moment, it became a wall. Now he attacked. 3 moves in a row. Fire upon fire upon fire. A chain reaction. Each card amplified the next. 18 points, 22, 26. The score had flipped. The examiner tried to block with water, but it was too late. She had no silence left to break the chain. Final move. Dan played the Firekeeper. The keeper granted a bonus to every card of its element already on the table. 3 fire cards on the table, 3 bonuses. The sphere flared red and went out. 100 points. The examiner gathered up the cards. She looked at Dan, then at Olvin. She nodded. Olvin jotted something down. The young woman with the angry eyes had passed the practical exam as well. She scored 71. The young man fell short. 54. He failed. He stood up from the table and walked away in silence. Dan watched his back and thought that in any world, defeat looks the same. Shoulders slumped, steps slightly wider than usual, eyes on the floor. Stage 3. Ethics. Olvin asked a question. What makes a game fair? A young woman answered first. She said that a game is fair when both players have equal access to the deck and when the dealer is impartial. Olvin nodded. He took notes. Then he looked at Dan. Dan was silent for 3 seconds. Then he said that a game is fair when the loser knows that he lost not because he was cheated, but because his opponent played better. And that the only way to guarantee this is when both players understand the mathematics behind the cards. They don't believe in luck. They don't rely on chance. They understand the numbers, because luck can be faked, but numbers cannot. Olvin looked at him for a long time. He didn't nod. He didn't take notes. He just looked. Then he said that was an unusual answer, and that he would remember it. Dan didn't know if that was good or bad. The results were announced an hour later. 2 people passed, Dan and a young woman. Renard was waiting by the exit. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes looked pleased. He held out a small wooden box. Inside lay a ring, bronze, dull, and warm to the touch. Dan slipped it onto the ring finger of his right hand. It fit snugly, as if it had been made just for him. He stepped out onto the street. The evening sun was setting over the harbor. Somewhere down below, by the pier, seagulls were squawking. Dan stood on the hill by the guild building and looked out over the city. Andvale lay before him. Rooftops, smoke. The lights of the halls, the noise of the crowd, a world where everything is decided at the card table. He now had the ring, the right to play, the right to challenge. Now he could begin. He touched the tag on his wrist. Debtor. But not just that anymore. Now also an arbiter. He walked down to the port, to the Silver Carp, to Lyra. He had to tell her that in a week he intended to challenge Goran Tess, and that he needed to know everything about Veles. Absolutely everything. Dan spent the week before the challenge focusing on Veles, not on his deck, not on practice, on the man himself. Lyra told him everything she remembered. Veles came to the Silver Carp once a month. He'd play 1 game, then he'd leave, always wearing the same dark blue frock coat with silver buttons, always silent. He'd sit down at the table, deal the cards. He wouldn't look at his opponent. He looked only at the table. Lyra had seen him 14 times over 2 years, 14 games, 14 wins, not a single loss. Dan asked for details. Lyra closed her eyes and began to recall. Veles always started with low cards, 2s, 3s. He'd give up the first 4 moves, lose points, show no reaction. Then on the 5th or 6th move, he'd play a face card, usually a guardian, sometimes a master, and he'd start to press, for a long time, monotonously, move by move, like a tide. By that point, his opponents were already getting nervous. They'd grown accustomed to his weakness, and when he started applying pressure, they couldn't adjust. Dan listened and nodded. A classic exhausting style. Give them the early lead. Make your opponent believe he's stronger, then take it all. In poker, this is called a slow roll. To beat him, you need one of two approaches. First, don't let him pick up momentum. Attack from the very first move and don't let up. Break his plan before it even starts working. Second, let him start applying pressure and catch him being predictable. If he always plays a guardian on the 5th or 6th turn, that means he has a guardian in his hand on the 5th or 6th turn. And that means you can prepare a response. Dan chose the second approach. The first would have been faster, but riskier. If Veles knew how to adapt to aggression, an attack on the first move could backfire on Dan. The second approach provided more information, more moves to read his opponent. More time to calculate. He asked Lyra about Veles's habits at the table. She recalled that Veles always sat up straight, his left hand on his right knee, his right hand on the table. He held his cards fanned out in his left hand, low against his chest. When he was thinking about a move, he would clench his jaw slightly. When he made a decision, he would relax it. Dan took mental notes. The jaw, that's good. The chewing muscles are the hardest to control. Even experienced poker players forget about the jaw. It works on autopilot. If he clenches, he's thinking. If he relaxes, he's decided. If Dan watches his jaw, he'll know the exact moment when Veles makes a decision. And by the delay between relaxation and the move, he could tell whether Veles was confident or bluffing. A confident person acts immediately after making a decision. A bluffer pauses, because bluffing requires effort. 3 days before the summons, Dan went to the guild and filed an application, a formal procedure. The bronze arbiter summons a civilian to a match over a dispute regarding a debt token. Dan's stake? 150 silver coins. That was almost his entire bankroll. 170 minus 20 for living expenses. He kept 20 for himself, enough for food and shelter for 2 weeks. If he lost, he'd be broke. If he won, Lyra would be free. Renard accepted the application and looked at him with an expression that Dan couldn't read. Then he said that Goran Tess had the right to send a hired player in his place. Dan said he knew. Renard said that Goran's hired player was Veles. Dan said he knew. Renard paused and said that Veles was a silver ring, and Dan was a bronze one, a difference of 2 ranks. Dan said he knew. Renard sighed and affixed his seal. Dan spent the 2 days leading up to the game in silence. He didn't play. He didn't go to the hall. He sat in his room and counted. Not cards. Himself. His left hand. The tremor. It appeared when the stakes were high, not when he was playing for 20 silver pieces with regulars, but when something real was on the line. He'd noticed it 3 days ago. He was playing a practice game with Lyra, and she jokingly said that if he lost, she'd go wash the dishes for the whole room. A trifle. Nonsense. But his left hand twitched for a second. He hit it. Lyra didn't notice, but he did. The parking lot. 3 in the morning. The white glow of the headlights. The blow. His body remembered. Not this body, but the memory was his. And when the stakes rose above a certain threshold, something inside him recalled that last second when he couldn't control anything. He lay on the bed and clenched his left hand into a fist. Unclenched it. Clenched it. Unclenched. It wouldn't go away. He knew that. So he had to learn to live with it. In Vegas, there was a dealer named Marcus. 20 years at the tables. Marcus's hands shook every morning. Stress-induced tremors. Marcus said the trick wasn't to stop the shaking. It was to make sure the shaking didn't affect the deal. He'd deal the cards so that the shaking became part of the rhythm, not a hindrance, but an element. Dan thought about that. Then he got up, sat down at the table. He laid out the deck and began to play with his left hand, only his left. An hour, 2, 3. By dawn, his left hand had stopped trembling. Not because the tremor had gone away, but because his fingers had grown accustomed to moving along with it. Game day. Silver carp. Evening. The hall was full. Lyra was singing. Her voice sounded different that evening. Lower, deeper. She knew what today meant. Dan arrived an hour before the start. He sat down at the table. The deck lay in the center. Silver. The real one. The game master in a red robe stood to the side. Renart was in the gallery. The scroll with the terms rested on a velvet stand. Dan read it. 150 silver pieces against Lyra Vane's IOU. The winner takes all. He signed it. 10 minutes later, Veles arrived. Dan saw him and realized that Lyra had been right. Tall. A dark blue frock coat. Silver buttons. A silver ring on his right hand. An expressionless face. Gray eyes. He sat down across from him in silence. He looked at the deck. Not at Dan, at the deck, and clenched his jaw slightly. There. Already. The first clue. He'd clenched his jaw before the hand even began. That meant he was thinking. That meant he'd been preparing. He knew who Dan was. Someone had told him. Maybe Goran. Maybe someone in the room. Veles hadn't just come to play. He came specifically to play against Dan. That changed the equation. If Veles had been preparing for Dan, it meant he might alter his usual style. He might not start with low cards. He might attack first. He might break his own pattern. Dan adjusted the ring on his finger. The bronze felt warm. The dealer announced the start game. Veles dealt. 7 cards to each player. Dan took his. He looked at them. 2 waters, 1 mirror, 1 herald of silence, 3 fires. A strong hand. Too strong, even. In Vegas, when you're dealt a hand that's too good, the first thing you do is stop and think. Because a good hand makes you greedy, and greed kills your judgment. Dan placed his cards face up on the table, not in his hand, on the table. It was a gesture, an open gesture that said, "I'm not hiding my cards. I'm not afraid." Veles noticed. His jaw relaxed slightly. Then it clenched again. He didn't know what to make of it. All right, first move. Veles laid down a card. Not a 2, not a 3. A 7 of fire, a middle card, neither low nor high. He'd changed his style, just as Dan had expected. He didn't start with the low cards. He started in the middle, testing the waters, feeling his way. Dan responded. A 2 of water. A weak move. Deliberately weak. He wanted to see how Veles would react to weakness. If Veles started pressing, it meant he was aggressive. If he waited, it meant he'd return to his usual style. Veles waited. He played a 5 of silence, a middle card. He wasn't pressing. He waited. So his style had only changed on the first move. Deep down, he remained the same, patient, wearing down his opponent, waiting. 4 moves. 5. 6. They exchanged average cards. The score was almost even. 54 for Veles, 58 for Dan. A slight lead, nothing decisive. The hall was silent. Lyra stood by the wall. She wasn't singing. She was watching. On the 7th move, Veles clenched his jaw and didn't relax it. Dan counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. His jaw was still clenched. He was thinking. He was thinking about something big. A face card. The Guardian or the Master. A move was coming. Dan waited. Veles relaxed his jaw. A pause. A second and a half between relaxing his jaw and making his move. A second and a half. Not right away. A bluff. He's bluffing. Dan looked at the card Veles had laid down. Master of Silence. A powerful card. It prevented Dan from bluffing 2 turns in a row and cost him 15 points. But Veles was bluffing. So it's not the Master of Silence. That means no. The card was already face up on the table. It was the Master of Silence. Dan saw it. The card is real. Then what's the bluff? Pause. 1.5 seconds. Dan thought. The bluff isn't in the card. The bluff is in the intention. Veles played a strong card, but his plan isn't in that card. He wants Dan to respond to the Master of Silence with something strong, to play his trump card. And then Veles will finish him off with whatever's left. Classic. A decoy. Show strength so your opponent wastes his, then strike where there's nothing left. Dan didn't play his trump card. He played a 3 of clubs. 3 points. Small change. He lost 15 to the Master, but he kept his hand. Veles blinked, quickly, just once. A blink after an unexpected move. He wasn't expecting that. He expected Dan to respond with a mirror or a messenger, but Dan responded with a 3. Dan played weakly for the next 3 moves. He gave up points. The score swung in Veles's favor, 68 to 44. The room rustled. Someone in the stands said aloud that the bronze boy was throwing the game. Dan heard it and didn't react. He waited. He waited for the moment when Veles would believe he was winning, when his jaw would relax for good, when he would start playing not by thinking, but by finishing off his opponent. On the 11th move, it happened. Veles's jaw had been relaxed for 3 moves in a row. He was betting quickly, not thinking, just going for the kill. He could already see victory. Dan gathered himself. His left hand trembled. He clenched his fingers under the table. Then he let go. The tremor settled into a rhythm, just as he'd taught himself, just like Marcus. 12th move. Dan played the Herald of Silence. Silence froze the table for a turn. Veles couldn't bet, couldn't bluff. He had to wait. 13th move. Dan played the Mirror. The Mirror copied Veles's last strong card, his own Master of Silence. 15 points returned. The score was even. 14th move. Dan laid down all 3 fire cards one after another. A triple chain. Fire amplified fire, amplified fire. The sphere flared up, not red, white. 32 points in a single move. The score was reversed. Veles sat motionless. His jaw was clenched so tightly his cheekbones turned white. He stared at the table, at the 3 fire cards, at the empty spaces in his hand. He had 1 card left. 1. Dan saw his eyes. There was recognition in them. Veles understood. Not now. He'd understood earlier. He'd understood on the 12th turn when Dan played the Herald. He realized he'd lost 3 moves ago when he relaxed his jaw, when he stopped thinking. But it was too late. Veles played his last card, a 5 of water, 5 points, a drop in the ocean. The sphere flickered and went out. The game was over. Dan had 104 points. Veles had 21. The referee announced the winner. The hall buzzed. Veles stood up. He looked at Dan, not with anger, with something resembling curiosity. Then he nodded, once, and walked away. Dan sat at the table, motionless. His left hand rested on his knee. It was trembling, subtly, quietly. No one saw. Lyra approached the table. The overseer handed her a scroll. She unrolled it. She read it. Lyra Vane's debt token is transferred to arbiter Dan Carrera. Lyra looked at him. Dan pulled a knife from his belt. Small, blunt, for cutting bread. He took the scroll and wrote a single line at the end. The debt is considered settled. The tag is destroyed. He signed it. Handed it to the administrator. The administrator read it, raised his eyebrows, then shrugged and affixed the seal. Lyra stood there, staring at the scroll, then at Dan, then back at the scroll. She wasn't crying. She just stood there and watched, and slowly removed the tag from her wrist. The leather cord slipped off her hand and fell onto the table. The wooden tag clattered against the silver of the deck. Lyra clenched her free wrist with her other hand, as if checking that it was real. Then she looked at Dan and said one word. "Thank you." Quietly, without a hint of a hoarse voice. In a clear voice Dan had never heard before. After the game with Veles, life changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but irreversibly. Lyra moved from the tiny room next to the hall to the room next to Dan's, above the bakery. The baker charged them 1.5 times the usual rate for the 2 rooms, and grumbled that his house wasn't an inn. But he continued to sell at a discount. Lyra didn't sing at the hall for 3 days. For the first 3 days of her freedom, she simply walked around town. Dan saw her from the window. She'd leave early in the morning and return in the evening. Without a goal, without a direction, she just walked. Like someone who is learning all over again to belong to herself. On the 4th day, she returned in the evening and knocked on his door. She said she'd found a job, not at the hall, at the market, working for a fabric merchant. She'd keep the books and take orders. The pay was low, but it was her money, her first in 3 years. Dan nodded and said he was glad. She paused. Then she said she wanted to help him, not out of gratitude, because he was the only person in Andwale who saw the cards the way she saw people, and because she needed to find her sister. And to do that, she needs to bring together those who know where her sister was taken, and for that, she needs the arbiter. Dan understood. It was honest, not friendship, not duty, a partnership. 2 people who needed each other. He held out his hand. She shook it, for the 2nd time. News of the victory over Veles spread through the halls of the Port District in 2 days. The nameless, homeless bronze arbiter had beaten the silver Veles, who hadn't lost in 5 years. At the Silver Carp, people began to look at Dan differently. Regulars who hadn't noticed him before now nodded in his direction. The bartender poured tea without being asked and placed a saucer of honey beside it. The manager in the red robe stopped calling him a servant. Trifles, but trifles that signaled a shift. A week after the game, Dean played again. The stakes were slightly higher, 30 silver pieces, 40. He was winning. He lost on purpose every other time. He was rebuilding his bankroll. By the end of the 3rd week, he had 220 silver pieces. A good cushion. Not wealth, but a safety net. On the 23rd day after his victory over Veles, a girl walked into the hall. She was 17, maybe 16, petite, quiet, with ink stains on her fingers, and big dark eyes that looked at the world as if she were trying to draw it. She walked up to the bar and asked the bartender if the hall needed a calligrapher. The bartender laughed and said that calligraphers work at the guild, not in pubs. The girl didn't leave. She stood at the bar and waited. Dan watched her from the lower level. Ink-stained fingers. A calligrapher. In Cartana, calligraphers aren't just people who write beautifully. Calligraphers make cards. They inscribe elemental symbols. They verify the authenticity of decks. They see magical patterns that ordinary people can't see. A good calligrapher is like a good casino security specialist. They see what others don't notice. Dan stood up and walked over to her. He asked her name. She said Sarah. Sarah Min. He asked why she was working in the gaming floor. She paused. Then she said she needed money. Her father was in the debt tower. He'd been there for 8 months already for refusing to forge cards for one of the trading houses. Sarah had handled his case on her own, at night, without a license, without a workshop, without tools. She worked with the stump of a brush on scraps of silver foil, making cards for small-time players who couldn't afford a guild deck. Dan asked if she could tell if a card was genuine at a glance. Sarah looked at him. Then she looked at the deck lying on the nearest table. She said that the third card from the top had been re-engraved. The symbol of water had been etched over the old symbol of silence. It was a counterfeit. Dan picked up the third card and held it up to the light. All he could see was smooth silver with the symbol of water. Nothing else. He called Renard. Renard came the following evening. He took the card. He turned it over in his hands. Then he pulled a small blue glass lens from his pocket and looked through it. His face went pale. He said the girl was right. The card had been re-engraved. Someone had replaced silence with water. Fine work, to the naked eye. But through the arbiter's magical lens it was clearly visible. And the girl had seen it without a lens, with her bare eyes. Renard looked at Sarah, then at Dan, then back at Sarah. He said he hadn't seen eyes like that in 20 years. Dan offered Sarah a job, not in the card room, at his place. He'd pay her 20 silver coins a month out of his own pocket. Her job would be to check the decks before each of his games, and to teach him to see what she sees: spontaneous patterns, magical imprints, forgeries, everything his eyes can't see, but hers can. Sarah was silent for a long time. Then she asked about her father. Dan said he couldn't promise anything yet, but if he continued to rise in rank, and if the right opportunity arose, he'd be able to put the question of her father's release on the table. Literally, only on the table. Sarah nodded. Once, briefly, and she stayed. She took up a corner of Lyra's room. She slept on a mattress on the floor. She worked at night by candlelight. Her fingers were always covered in ink. She spoke little. She observed a lot. And she started a small notebook in which she wrote down the words that Dan sometimes let slip. Poker face, variance, tilt, bankroll. She didn't know what they meant, but she wrote down every one. She drew little pictures next to them. She drew tilt as a tilted ship, bankroll as a scroll full of coins, poker face as a face without eyes. Dan saw it one morning when she forgot to close her notebook. He stood over her, looking at the drawings, and thought that in this world, where everything is decided at the table, there are people who don't play, who just draw, and that these people might be more valuable than any arbiter. A month after the victory over Veles, what Dan had been waiting for and fearing happened. A man from the Velmore Arbiters Guild arrived at the Silver Carp. Not Renard, not a local, a man from far away. He wore a black cloak with silver embroidery in the shape of 3 intertwined rings, the Velmore coat of arms. He sat in the upper gallery and watched as Dan played a game for 40 silver pieces against a local merchant. Dan won. The man in the black cloak approached after the game. He introduced himself. His name was Torvin. He said he represented the interests of the Velmore Guild, and that rumors had reached them about a new arbiter in Andwale, a young man with no home, a bronze ring, and a playing style unlike anything they'd seen before. He said the Velmore Guild was interested, and that he was authorized to offer Dan a 3rd-rank ring and a position at court. No exam, no trials, just come. The position is ready. The salary is ready. Dan stood there and listened. A 3rd-rank ring. That was higher than bronze, between bronze and silver. A position at court. A salary. Stability. Security. Immunity. everything he needed to grow and to protect his own. But at Velmore's court, within reach of King Saros, the very same Saros who had subjugated the three kingdoms from behind a card table, the very same Saros whose school sends mercenary arbiters to small towns to take the fishermen's coves from them. Dan looked Torvin in the eyes. They were intelligent, calm, patient. The eyes of a man accustomed to getting what he wants. Dan smiled, politely, evenly, and said he appreciated the offer, that it was an honor, and that he would think it over. Torvin nodded. He left a thin silver business card on the table with the address of Velmore's representative office in Andwheel. Then he left. Dan picked up the card. He turned it over in his fingers. Then he put it in his pocket. Lyra approached him from behind. She had heard everything. She asked what he was going to do. Dan said nothing. That the offer wasn't a gift, it was a trap, and that whoever accepts a ring from Velmore's hands also accepts silence along with it. Lyra nodded. Sarah was standing in the corner, drawing something in her notebook. Dan thought his team was growing. 2 women, one who hears everything, another who sees everything, and him, who calculates everything. That was the beginning. 2 days after Torvin's visit, Dan went to take the exam for the 3rd rank. Not in Velmore, at the Andwheel Guild, on his own. When Renart heard about this, he was silent for a long time. Then he said that the 3rd rank exam wasn't the same as the bronze exam. The theory was more complex. The practical part was tougher. And the 3rd stage wasn't a question. It was a match. A real match, with real stakes, against an active 3rd rank arbiter or higher. If you lose, you don't get the ring. And you lose your stake. Dan asked what the stake was. Renart said that the examinee stakes whatever they deem necessary, and the examiner stakes their time, a symbolic stake. But for the examinee, the stake is real. Dan nodded. He asked who would be the examiner. Renart said that, according to the rules, the examiner is appointed by the guild's senior arbiter. In Andwheel, that's Olvin. Olvin will appoint whoever he deems necessary. Dan submitted his application. Olvin accepted it that same day. The theory exam was in 3 days, the practical exam in 5, the match in 7. Dan spent the 3 days preparing for the theory exam with Sarah. She knew the deck better than anyone. Not the numbers, the magic. She showed him how the elemental patterns on the cards interacted, not just according to the rules, but according to a deeper logic. Fire and water aren't just opposites. Fire after water leaves steam, an invisible effect. The next card after steam loses 1 level of accuracy. This means the numerical value can deviate by 1 unit up or down, randomly. No one had ever accounted for this effect. No one even knew it existed. Sarah knew. She saw the steam, a wisp of smoke above the card after fire was placed on water. To her, it was obvious. To everyone else, it was just a pretty detail. Dan sat motionless and listened. Then he asked how many such hidden effects existed. Sarah thought for a moment and said at least 12, that she knew of, maybe more. 12 hidden variables. 12 factors that don't fit into any model. Not in his, not in anyone's. Because no one sees them, except calligraphers. Dan understood why calligraphers were so valuable in this world. They didn't just make cards. They understood the cards on a level the players couldn't reach. It was as if, in poker, there were people who could see right through a card's back. Not cheating, talent. He began to rebuild his model, adding variables, recalculating probabilities to account for pairs and other hidden effects. The table in his head doubled in size. It became more complex, more beautiful, more accurate. He passed the theory exam without a single mistake. Alvin asked questions for 2 hours. Dan answered precisely, calmly. When Alvin asked about the steam effect, Dan answered and saw the senior arbiter's hands tremble. Alvin asked how he knew that. Dan said he could see it. It was true. He could see it. Through Sarah. Through her eyes. Through a sketchbook in which steam was drawn as a little cloud with a sad face. He passed the practical exam as well, a game for points with no stakes. The examiner was a silver arbiter from the guild, a sturdy, middle-aged man with a fast and rough playing style, an aggressive style, a head-on attack. Dan won in 25 minutes, 93 points out of 100. The examiner stood up from the table and said he hadn't seen such precise play from a bronze-level player in a long time. 1 game remained. Alvin announced the examiner. Dan expected someone from the locals, a silver-level player, maybe the same one who had examined him during the practical. But Alvin named someone else, Evelyn Holt. Dan didn't recognize the name. Renart did. He turned pale. He pulled Dan aside and quickly explained. Evelyn Holt, a former court arbiter, a first-rank ring-bearer. 7 years ago, she refused to play along with a political faction at the court of one of the southern kingdoms. She was stripped of her ring. Officially, for a breach of ethics. Unofficially, for not bending to the will of the court. Since then, she had lived in Andwheel, quietly, without a ring, without factions. She drank black tea. She wore men's suits. And she hadn't sat down at a table for 7 years. Dan asked why Olvin had appointed her. Renart said he didn't know. Maybe because Olvin wants to see what happens when 2 unusual players meet. Or maybe because Olvin is old and loves drama. The game was scheduled for the evening, in the guild hall, not at the Silver Carp. Officially, with witnesses present. Dan arrived an hour early. He sat down at the table. Lyra and Sarah stood by the wall. Renart was on the balcony. Olvin sat in a chair in the corner. 20 minutes later, Evelyn Holt walked in. Tall, her red hair pulled back. A dark gray men's suit. A white shirt. No jewelry, no rings. Her hands were empty. Her eyes were green, sharp. She looked around the room, at the table, at the deck, at Dan, and she squinted slightly. Like someone looking at the sun after a long period of darkness. She sat down across from him. She didn't say hello. She didn't smile. She just sat down and placed her hands on the table. Her hands were long, slender, no ink, no calluses. Hands that hadn't held cards in 7 years. Dan placed his bet. 50 silver pieces. Not all he had. He remembered the rule. Never bet more than you're willing to lose. The dealer announced the start. Dan made the first move. A 5 of fire, a standard opening, a moderate pace. He wanted to see how she played. After 7 years. After everything. Evelyn took a card from her hand. She looked at it, and Dan saw her fingers twitch, slightly, for half a second. A tremor. Not his tremor, hers, of a different nature. His tremor came from death, hers from loss. 7 years away from the table, 7 years feeling broken. And now the cards were in her hands again. She laid down her card, Herald of Mirrors, a strong first move, aggressive. Harold copied his 5 and reflected it back. 10 points for him, -10 for her. No, on the contrary, +10 for her, -5 for him. The mirror worked both ways. A cunning move, a smart move. The move of someone who remembers how to play, even if the body has forgotten. The game moved quickly, faster than with Velas. Evelyn didn't wear him down. She attacked, hard, precisely, without wasted moves. Every card in its place. Every bet calculated. Dan could see the experience. Behind every move of hers lay years at court, thousands of games, tens of thousands of cards. She didn't count like he did. She felt it. But she felt it with a precision that was astonishing. By the 10th move, the score was even, 63 each, a stalemate. Dan looked at her hands. The tremor had passed. Her fingers were steady, calm. She was back. With every move she was coming back, as if the 7 years had been nothing more than a long dream, and now she had woken up. Dan could have tried to win. He had a combination: the mirror, the keeper, and 2 waters. A good finishing move. But he looked at Olven in his chair. The old arbiter wasn't looking at the cards. He was looking at Evelyn, at her hands, at her face, at the way she was sitting at the table again. And Dan realized why Olven had appointed her. Not for Dan's exam, for Evelyn's exam. So she would sit down again. So she would pick up the cards again. So someone would give her a table where she could play without shame. Dan made his move. Not the best one. On purpose. He left her an opening. A small gap in his defense through which she could strike. Evelyn saw the gap. And she struck. Watermaster. Cascade. 24 points per move. Dan lost. The score was now 87 for her and 39 for him. The hall fell silent. Renart leaned forward from the gallery. Dan was losing, visibly. But he didn't need a victory. He needed 60 points to pass the exam, and he was racking them up. Slowly, card by card, not attacking, defending, scoring small points from counterattacks and parries. By the last turn, he had 61. Evelyn had scored 102. She won. Cleanly, beautifully, without a doubt. The referee announced the result. Dan had scored 61. The threshold was 60. He'd cleared it. 50 silver coins were gone as his stake. But the 3rd-rank ring was now his. Olven rose from his chair. He walked over to the table. He looked at Dan, then at Evelyn, and said he hadn't seen a game like that in a long time. Then he handed Dan a box. Inside was a ring. Silver with a bronze band, 3rd rank. Dan put it on in place of the bronze one. Evelyn stood up from the table. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were dry. She turned toward the exit. Dan said her name. She stopped. He said he was looking for people who could see what he couldn't, and that she could see more than anyone else at that table. Evelyn turned around. She looked at him, for a long time, with the same narrowed gaze as at the beginning. Then she said he'd lost on purpose. Dan said he hadn't lost. He'd scored 61. That was a pass. Evelyn said he could have scored 90. She'd seen his hand. She knew he'd held back the guardian. Dan didn't argue. Evelyn was silent for a moment. Then she said she liked black tea, and that if he was serious, he should come to the tea house on Berezovaya Street tomorrow morning. She'd be there at 8. And she left. Dan watched her go. Lyra walked up to him and whispered that this woman was dangerous. Dan said he knew, and that was exactly why he needed her. The tea house on Berezovaya Street was small, 6 tables, low stools, windows facing east. The morning sun poured light onto the wooden floor, and the air smelled of something bitter and grassy. Evelyn was sitting by the window. In front of her stood a dark clay teapot and a cup without a handle. The tea was black, thick, almost like coffee. Dan sat across from her. He ordered the same tea. Evelyn didn't start the conversation. She sipped her tea and waited. Dan realized he had to speak first. He started with something simple. He told her what he was doing, that he was putting together a team, that he had Lyra, who could hear everything happening in the hall, Sarah, who could see magic on the cards, and him, who does the calculations. But he was missing someone who knew the court, the guild, the politics, who owes whom, who's whose ally, who's whose enemy. Without that, he was playing blind. He wins battles, but doesn't understand the war. Evelyn listened. Then she set down her cup and said that war was a big word. Dan said he wasn't the first to say it, that Velmore was already at war, through the card table, through hired arbiters, through offers of third-rank rings to people they wanted to buy off. He was offered a position at court. He refused. And now he's waiting for the consequences. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. She asked who had made the offer. Dan said the name, Torvin. Evelyn said she knew Torvin, a recruiter, not a player, a bureaucrat, the right-hand man of Lord Arbiter Cassian Vale. Dan remembered the name, Cassian Vale. He asked who that was. Evelyn explained. Cassian Vale, 41 years old, a first-rank ring, the face of the Velmore School, King Cyros's court player. Not a villain, not a monster, an intelligent man, educated, polite, sincerely believing that a world where a single strong player maintains order better than a world where 100 weak ones pull in different directions. He doesn't hate people like Dan. He considers them a defect, a flaw in the system that needs to be quietly eliminated. Dan asked how. Evelyn listed the steps. First, they buy you off. They offer a ring and a seat. If you don't take it, they compromise you. They plant a marked deck before the game. They accuse you of cheating. Cheating in Cartana isn't a fine. It means losing your ring and being branded a debtor. Forever. If even that doesn't work, they eliminate you. Not with a sword, with a game of honor. A challenge you can't refuse. The stakes are your life. Dan was silent. He drank his tea, bitter, strong, good. He asked what had happened to her. Evelyn didn't answer for a long time. Then she spoke. 7 years ago, she had been playing at the court of Elvana, a southern kingdom, beautiful, warm. She was a first-rank arbiter, 22 years old, the youngest in Elvana's history. They seated her at the table for a political game, a dispute between two houses. On the surface, it was about a trade route. In reality, it was about power. One of the houses was an ally of Velmore, the other was not. Evelyn was supposed to play for the Velmore house, not to lose, to play along, to let her opponent make a mistake, to steer the game so that the right side would win. She refused. She stood up from the table. She said aloud in front of everyone that the game was rigged, that the conditions were rigged, that the deck was unbalanced. The room fell silent. 2 days later, they took her ring away. A week later, she was declared persona non grata in Elvan. A month later, she found herself in Andwheel, without a ring, without money, without a name. With just a teapot and a habit of drinking black tea by the bucketful. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said one thing, that she was right. Back then, 7 years ago. She was right, and she was punished for it. And that this is the most normal thing in the world that happens at a card table. The honest are punished. The cheaters wear silk. And that the only way to fix this is not through speeches or war, but through another game. A game in which the rules work as they should. Evelyn looked at him. In her green eyes was something Dan saw in the mirror every morning. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who knows they're right, but is tired of the fact that it doesn't change anything. She asked what exactly he was proposing. Dan said that in 2 months he planned to file his candidacy for the first major party. Not for the money, for the people. On the East Coast, there are fishing villages from which Velmore, from behind a desk, took away the right to fish in their own waters. A bay tax. Senseless, extortionate, pushed through by a party in which the village head played against Velmore's court arbitrator. He didn't stand a chance. Dan wanted to request a review. By law, any arbitrator of the third rank or higher has the right to challenge the outcome of a match if they can prove the conditions were unequal. Sarah can prove the deck was rigged. Lyra can find witnesses. But Dan needs someone who understands court mechanics, someone who knows which houses will support him and which won't. Someone who sees not the cards, but the chessboard on the table. He needs Evelyn. She was silent for a minute. Then she poured herself another cup of tea, then one for him. Then she said she had a condition. Dan waited. She said she wouldn't play. She wouldn't sit at the table. She wouldn't pick up the cards. She would be an advisor, a strategist. She'd stand behind him and whisper in his ear who was bluffing and who wasn't. But she wouldn't sit down herself. Because if she sat down at the table, her hands would start to shake and she'd lose. And she couldn't let that happen. Not again. Dan nodded. He accepted the condition. He didn't argue. He didn't try to talk her out of it. He knew what tremors were like. And he knew you couldn't rush someone who was treating him. They drank tea until noon. Evelyn talked about the courtyard, about the guild, about Cassian Vale, about how the system worked. Dan listened and built a new model in his head, not a probabilistic model, a political one. Who owes whom? Who fears whom? Who would win if Velmore were to weaken? Who would lose if Dan were to grow stronger? By noon, a map had formed in his mind. Not a deck of cards, a map of the continent, the 7 kingdoms, the 7 first-rank arbiters, dozens of connections, hundreds of debts, and a single crack between the world of cards and the world that had grown tired of cards. Evelyn stood up. She said she'd be right here tomorrow morning, and every morning, as long as she was interested. Dan said he'd try to stay interesting. Evelyn smiled for the first time all morning, briefly, with just one corner of her mouth. Just like Lyra, only colder. Dan left the tea house and headed home. On the way, he thought about how his team now consisted of 4 people. Him, Lyra, Sarah, Evelyn. Each one sees what the others don't. Together, they covered almost all the blind spots. Almost. He was still missing 2 things. A person who knows the rules. Not just the rules of one kingdom, all the rules. All the decks, all the differences between the 7 kingdoms. And someone who knew the seedy side of the game. Card cheating, swapping cards, craps, traps. Not to cheat himself, but to spot cheating when it was thrown his way. Because Evelyn had made it clear, Velmore's next move after refusal would be to compromise him. A rigged deck, an accusation of card cheating, and Dan had to be ready. He found both of them in a single week. Evelyn brought the first one. 3 days after their morning conversation, Evelyn came to the bakery not alone. A petite woman was walking beside her. No, a young woman. 22 years old, maybe 21. Short, neat, with perfect posture that made Dan's back ache. She walked steady, as if she'd been carrying a bowl of water on her head for 22 years without spilling a single drop. Evelyn introduced her. Una Rio, the daughter of a former diplomat from the kingdom of Chesson, the southern kingdom. Far away, warm. Una bowed, deeply, formally, as if Dan were an ambassador rather than a man in a wrinkled shirt standing outside a bakery. He nodded in response. Una sat down on a chair, straight, knees together, hands on her knees, back straight. She didn't move. Dan looked at her and thought that this girl was either incredibly disciplined or incredibly frightened, or both. Evelyn explained briefly. Una knows by heart the codes of all 7 crowns, all 7 decks, all the differences, all the exceptions. 3 obsolete versions of the rules that had been abolished decades ago but never formally repealed. She's a living encyclopedia. And she's on the run. Dan asked what from. Yuna answered herself. Her voice was quiet, steady, with a slight accent. Her father was a Chesan diplomat in Galvena, a neutral city. 3 years ago, Velmore pushed a trade agreement through at the card table. The agreement was exploitative. Chesan was losing control of the southern trade route. Yuna's father refused to sign it. He was recalled. The family was placed under tacit house arrest. Not in prison. Worse. In a house. With closed gates. With a ban on correspondence. With smiling guards who forbade nothing but allowed nothing. Yuna fled. Through a window. At night. With 1 bag and 3 rule books. It took her 4 months to reach Andvale. On foot. By cart. Once on a ship that took her on in exchange for work in the galley. She came to Andvale to find a way to restore her father's freedom, and to do that, she needed to renegotiate that trade agreement. And to renegotiate it, she needed a political party. And to form a party, she needed an arbiter who wasn't afraid of Velmore. Evelyn found her 3 days ago in the guild library. Yuna was sitting in a corner, transcribing the rules of the Andvale deck into a comparison chart with the Chesan deck. The librarian wanted to kick her out. Evelyn stopped him. They talked. Evelyn realized who she was dealing with, and she brought her to Dan. Dan asked Yuna one question. If, in a game played by Andvale's rules, a player uses a memory card after a mirror, but Velmore's rules prohibit the use of memory on the next turn after a mirror, which rule applies in a neutral city with a mixed deck? Yuna answered without hesitation. The host's rule. A neutral city uses its own set of rules. In Andvale, memory is allowed after a mirror. In Galvena, it's prohibited. In Chesan, it's allowed but with a restriction. Memory reveals only numerical values, while face-up cards remain hidden. Dan nodded. This was exactly what he needed. Someone who knew the rules better than a judge, someone who could find a loophole or a defense that no one remembers. He offered Yuna a spot on the team. The same 20 silver coins a month. Yuna bowed. She agreed, and immediately asked if she could sleep in the guild library because the books there were more comfortable than a mattress. Dan smirked and said he'd find her a room. Not in the library. He found the second one himself. 4 days after Yuna. Late at night after a game for 30 silver. He was walking home through the harbor district. Narrow streets, streetlights, wet cobblestones. And at the corner by the warehouses, he saw a fight. No, not a fight. A beating. 2 large men had pinned a third against the wall. No, a third person. A woman. Slender, wearing black gloves. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't calling for help. She was just standing against the wall, waiting for them to finish. One of the men struck her in the face. She fell. She got up. She spat. And she stood against the wall again. As if she were used to it. As if she knew how many blows were left and was counting them like cards in a deck. Dan stopped. He'd seen it all in Vegas. Beatings in alleys, drunken brawls, debt settlements. He knew it was foolish to get involved in someone else's fight. He wasn't a fighter, not a hero, not a warrior. But he also knew those 2 weren't robbers. Robbers take what they want and leave. These guys were beating him, methodically, for a reason. He walked over, not quickly, calmly, like a casino manager approaching a table where there's a problem. One of the men turned around. Dan showed his ring, 3rd rank, silver with a bronze stripe. The man looked at the ring, then at the other man. They exchanged glances. A 3rd rank arbiter has legal immunity. Striking an arbiter while on duty means jail. Striking an arbiter off duty means a match of honor to be arranged by G. And in both cases, you lose. The men left, silently, quickly. Dan looked at the woman by the wall. She was crouching. Her lip was split. Her left eye was swelling shut. She wore black gloves on both hands. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark, wary, like a cat that had been caught, but whose fate had not yet been decided. Dan asked why they'd beaten her. She said it was because of her job. He asked what kind of job. She remained silent. Then she said she was a cold deck. Dan knew that term. Cold deck. In Vegas, that's what they call a rigged deck that a card cheat slips into the game instead of the real one. All the cards are in the right order. The outcome of the hand is predetermined. Here, a cold deck referred to a person, a professional card cheat, the one who swaps out decks, controls the top card, shuffles falsely, does everything Dan had been catching on the monitors for 6 years. Her name was Isolde. Isolde Kane. 26 years old. She worked for the Port Guild. Con artists. An organized group that made money off rigged games. Isa prepared the decks. But something went wrong. The last job fell through. The deck was exposed. The guild punished the operator. That is, Isa. Dan listened and thought. A professional card cheat. She knows all the tricks from the inside, all the switches, all the ways to cheat. Everything Dan knew in theory, she knew by heart. Literally. Her fingers in those black gloves could do what his eyes could see. He held out his hand to her. She looked at it. She didn't take it. She asked what he needed. Dan told her the truth. He needed someone who could spot cheating, not from cameras, but from the deck of cards. Someone who knew how they switch cards, how they mark the cards, how they signal. Because soon they'll slip him a marked deck, and he has to spot it before they frame him. Isa looked at him for a long time. Then she asked what he didn't need. Dan said he didn't need her to cheat. She laughed, briefly, hoarsely, the sickly laugh of a split lip. Then she stood up, wiped the blood off with the back of her glove, and said she'd go with him, because she had nowhere else to go. And because the man who shows a ring instead of a fist is the first person like that in her life. She followed him to the bakery. Dan gave her his room and moved into the storage room next door. The storage room smelled of flour and mice. He lay on a narrow shelf and counted. 5 people. Him, Lyra, Sarah, Evelyn, Una, and now Isa. 6. Each with their own pain, each with their own talent. Lyra hears. Sarah sees magic. Evelyn knows the courtyard. Una knows the rules. Isa knows deception. And he counts. 6 people against the system that holds the continent together. It was madness. But Dan knew one thing. In Vegas, one good team is worth 1,000 loners. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow he'd have to start preparing for the fisherman's game, the first high-stakes game, the first real challenge, and the first chance to show the continent that at the table you can do more than just rob. At the table, you can give back. The game for the fisherman was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Dan spent those weeks just as he did preparing for every serious game: reconnaissance, analysis, rehearsal. Evelyn worked through her own channels. She still had contacts in the guilds of the 3 kingdoms, former colleagues, people who remembered her and weren't afraid to talk. A week later, she came up with a name. The arbiter who had won the tax on the bay from the fishermen was named Darian Ress. A second-rank ring, a courtier of Velmore, a student of Cassian Vale's school, 35 years old, calm, calculating, not a genius, a craftsman, a solid player with no weaknesses, but no brilliance either. Those are the most dangerous of all. Geniuses make mistakes out of pride. Craftsmen make no mistakes at all. Evelyn described his style: balanced, neither aggression nor defense, the middle. The golden mean, from which it's hard to dislodge him. He doesn't press, and he doesn't wait. He plays steadily, like a metronome, move by move, point by point. No sudden surges, no slumps. You can't use the same tactics against him that worked on Velas. Velas let his guard down. Darien won't. Never. Dan thought about it for 3 days. Then he gathered the team in the room above the bakery. 6 people in the baker's pantry: Lyra on the bed, Sarah on the floor, Evelyn on a chair by the window. Una was standing because there weren't enough chairs, and she refused to sit on the bed for reasons related to etiquette that Dan didn't understand. Isa was sitting on the windowsill, wearing gloves, as always. Dan explained the plan. He wouldn't play against Darien the way everyone else does. He wouldn't try to outscore him. You can't outscore a balanced player in a head-to-head match. It's like trying to shout down an echo. Instead, he would play by the rules. Una looked up. Dan looked at her and said he needed a loophole. Not cheating, a legal loophole in the rules that allows you to change the conditions of the game after it has started. Una thought for 40 seconds. Then she said that such a loophole existed. In the Andvale Rulebook, paragraph 16, article 4, if one of the parties can prove that a previous game regarding the same dispute was conducted in violation of the rules, specifically using a rigged or unequal deck, then the current arbiter has the right to demand a review of the deck and its replacement with a neutral one. A neutral deck is one from the guild's vault, not the one brought by the parties. Clean, verified, untampered with. Dan asked if Sarah could prove that the deck in the fisherman's match had been tampered with. Sarah said she could, if the deck had been preserved. According to the rules, decks from official matches are stored in the guild's archive for 5 years. The match against the fisherman took place 2 years ago. The deck should be in the archive. Dan sent Sarah to the guild's archive. Renard helped her gain access. Sarah spent the entire day in the archive. She returned in the evening with red eyes and 3 pages of notes. The deck had been tampered with. 3 silence cards had been re-engraved. The elemental symbols were etched with a microscopic misalignment that weakened their effect by 1.5 points. For an ordinary player, the difference is imperceptible. For a calligrapher, it's a scandal. 3 weakened silence cards meant that the fisherman's leader couldn't defend himself against attacks. His silence weaker than it should have, and his opponent's silence worked at full strength. Dan held 3 pages in his hands and felt anger. A quiet, cold anger. The same anger he'd felt in Vegas when he'd spotted yet another con artist on surveillance cameras, fleecing retirees at the blackjack tables. The anger of a professional who'd been shown a dirty work. He filed a complaint with the guild, an official one, with evidence. Paragraph 16, Article 4, a demand for a review of the party's decision on the bay tax. Alvin accepted the complaint. Velmore found out that very same day. Dan knew he would find out. That was exactly what he was counting on. Party day. The Andwale Guildhall. Not the Silver Carp, an official venue. High ceilings, stone walls, the crests of the 7 kingdoms on the banners. A table in the center. A silver deck from the guild's vault. Clean, verified, neutral. Darien Ress arrived in the morning. Dan saw him and realized that Evelyn was right, a craftsman. Of average height, of average age, an average face. Nothing memorable. His clothes were neat but not luxurious. A second-rank ring on his finger. He sat down at the table without a greeting, without emotion, as if he were going to work. The hall was full. The fishermen had arrived. 100 people. They stood on the lower level, tanned, silent, with hands accustomed to ropes, not cards. Dan asked them for one thing before the game. Let everyone write on a piece of paper the name of the person they're feeding with this money. A wife, a child, a mother, a dog, anyone. They wrote them down. 100 slips of paper. Dan gathered them into a stack and placed it next to himself. Not on the table, next to him, by his elbow. Darian looked at the stack, at the slips of paper, at the fisherman. His expression didn't change, not by a millimeter. The tournament director announced the start. The deck was neutral, clean, unmanipulated. For the first time, Darian was playing on equal footing. Dan could tell from his opening moves. Darian was used to decks where he had an advantage. Not a crude one, a subtle one. A point and a half here, a micro shift there. Small weights on his side of the scale. Now there were no weights, and his metronome had gone off beat. Not by much, half a tone, but Dan could hear it. For the first 5 moves, Dan played evenly. He mirrored Darian's style, move for move, point for point, showing him that he could play just like him, that the math worked the other way too. On the 6th move, Dan changed the tempo. He played silence. Darian responded with water. Dan played a second silence. Darian froze. 2 silences in a row. Aggressive defense. Darian couldn't bluff for 2 turns. 2 turns during which Dan attacked. Fire, mirror, herald, chain. Fast, precise. 27 points in 3 turns. Darian lost his rhythm and never regained it. Dan kept the pressure on, not ruthlessly, methodically. Just as Darian himself had pressured the fisherman's chief 2 years ago, only fairly. By the 15th move, the score was 91 for Dan and 34 for Darian. The game was decided. Darian played his last card, a trio of water. 3 points. Nothing. The sphere went dark. The referee announced the winner. The hall buzzed. The fishermen on the gallery didn't shout. They didn't clap. They stood in silence and stared at the table. At Dan. At the stack of slips of paper by his elbow. Dan stood up. He bowed to Darian. Darian didn't respond. He stood up and walked away. Without a word. Without a handshake. His back straight. His stride steady. A craftsman. He lost. He left, just like going to work. Dan took the stack of slips of paper. He approached the fisherman's elder. He handed it over. He didn't say a word. The head of the fisherman took the stack with both hands, as if it were a sacred object. He pressed it to his chest. 100 names. Wives, children, mothers, dogs. The people for whom it was worth sitting down at the table. The scroll was signed. The tax on the cove was canceled. The fishermen were free. Lyra stood by the wall and didn't sing. She was crying, quietly, silently. Sarah was drawing something in her notebook. Evelyn was drinking tea from a flask. Una stood with her back straight, staring at the table. Isa sat in the corner and, for the first time in a week, took off one glove, her left one. She simply took it off and placed it on her knee. Dan didn't know why, but he sensed that it meant something. The next morning, the news spread through the leaflets. The homeless bronze arbiter had defeated the courtier Velmore and returned the cove to the fisherman. The leaflets gave him a nickname, the Counter. 3 months had passed since the game with the fisherman. 3 months during which everything had accelerated. Dan was playing. A lot. Often. Not petty disputes over silver. Real games. With the guild backing him. With witnesses. With signatures on scrolls that changed people's lives. He annulled the exploitative grain supply contract that was strangling the farmers in the valley. He won the right to water for 3 villages whose wells had been cut off by the Velmorian overseer through a game. He broke the chain of debt involving 4 token holders in which one person lost to another, who lost to a third, and so on. Every game was prepared. Every move was calculated. Sarah checked the decks. Una searched the rules for shields and loopholes. Evelyn decided which observers to call and which to leave out. Before each game, Isa would touch the deck with her gloves on and silently nod if it was clean, or shake her head if it wasn't. Lyra sat in the halls and listened to the conversations. Who was betting on them? Who was against them? Who was whispering in the corners? The team worked, like a well-oiled machine, like clockwork. By the end of the third month, Dan applied for a second-rank ring. Not through an exam, through recognition. According to guild rules, an arbiter receives second rank if they've won 15 official matches within a year and have never been caught violating the rules. Dan had won 17. 3 of those were against higher-ranked arbiters. Not a single violation, not a single complaint. Ulvin presented him with the ring personally, a silver one, pure, without a bronze band. Second rank, the right to schedule matches, legal immunity throughout all 7 kingdoms. Dan stood in the guild hall and looked at the ring. 6 months ago, he had been lying on the marble floor, not knowing where he was. Now he had the ring, a team, a name, a reputation, and enemies. The enemies didn't take long to appear. A week after he attained second rank, it happened. Dan was preparing for a game, a dispute over a river crossing between 2 cities, a medium-stakes game, nothing spectacular. That morning before the game, Sarah checked the deck. Clean. Dan sat down at the table. The dealer placed the deck in the center. Dan reached out his hand and stopped. It was a different deck, not the one Sarah had checked that morning. Same box, same guild crest, but a different deck. Dan knew this because that morning, the third card from the top had been a 7 of fire. He'd memorized it automatically, a habit, 6 years in the observation room. Now the third card from the top was different. The card lay slightly differently. The corner was off by a millimeter. A switch. Between the morning check and the game, someone had swapped out the deck. A marked deck. If he started playing with it, the marks would be discovered. Not now. Later. When the game was over and someone from Velmore filed a complaint. Card cheating. The loss of the ring, the debtor's tag, the end. That was exactly how Evelyn had described the second step. Compromise. Dan hadn't touched the deck. He sat at the table and stared at it. His opponent was waiting. The tournament director was waiting. The room was waiting. Dan looked at Isa. She was standing by the wall, wearing gloves. She saw his gaze. She understood. She walked over to the table silently. She reached for the deck. The tournament director wanted to stop her, but Dan raised his hand. He said he was exercising the right of a second-rank arbiter to inspect the deck before the match. Una from the gallery confirmed it. Paragraph 22. A second-rank referee or higher has the right to an independent deck inspection if they declare it before the first move. The tournament director stepped back. Isa took the deck. She removed her right glove. For the first time in front of an audience. Her fingers were long, slender, with calluses on her fingertips from thousands of hours of working with cards. She began to shuffle, slowly, card by card. She didn't look at the faces of the cards. She touched the backs. She ran her finger along the edge of the third card. Then the 5th. Then the 11th. Then she placed the deck on the table and said one word. Marked. The room buzzed. The manager turned pale. Dan asked for Ulvin to be summoned. Ulvin arrived 20 minutes later. Sarah examined the cards. She confirmed it. 11 of the 52 cards were marked. Tiny dots on the backs. Invisible to the eye, but detectable by touch. Whoever had marked them knew that Dan checked with his eyes, not his fingers. They were counting on Dan, not on Isa. They didn't know about Issa. Alvin ordered an investigation. The game was postponed. The deck was seized as evidence. Dan walked out of the room. His hands weren't shaking. His left hand was steady. Strange. At the moment when the stakes were highest, the tremor didn't come. Maybe because he wasn't playing alone. Maybe because Issa was standing right there. Maybe because, for the first time ever, he'd trusted not just the numbers, but the people. That evening, they sat in the storage room above the bakery, all 6 of them. Dan explained what it meant. Velmore moved on to the second step. The buyout hadn't worked. The blackmail had failed. That leaves the third option, a game of honor, a challenge that cannot be refused. The stakes are life itself. Evelyn said it might take some time before the game of honor. Months, maybe a year. Cassian Vale isn't in a hurry. He's planning. Every move he makes is calculated. He isn't angry. He's calculating. Dan nodded. So they have time. Time to grow. Time to prepare. Time to gather allies. A month later, an invitation arrived. Not a game of honor. Something else. The Tournament of the 7 Rings in neutral Galvena, held once every 3 years. Referees from across the continent. All ranks. All kingdoms. The winner receives not a prize, but a right. The right to pose a single question to the Council of the 7 Crowns. Any question. Dan read the invitation. Then he read it again. Then he looked at Evelyn. She nodded. If he made it to the finals, he could ask a question about revising the charter of the Cart of Consent. Officially. In front of everyone. Dan told the team to pack their things. They were heading to Galven. Galven was 4 times larger than Andwheel, a neutral city, belonging to no one, belonging to everyone and no one. It stood at the crossroads of 3 trade routes and thrived on tournaments. The streets were wider, the houses taller, the halls were more opulent. And towering over the entire city was the Palace of Rings, a massive white stone building with 7 towers, 1 for each kingdom. This was where the tournament was being held. Dan and the team arrived 4 days before it began. They rented 2 floors in a tavern near the market square. Cheap, but clean. Una went straight to the palace library. She returned 6 hours later with a complete list of the tournament rules. 32 participants, 4 rounds. Losers are eliminated after each round. The final is 1-on-1. The tournament deck is special. Not from Andvale, not from Velmore, but a mixed deck. 64 cards instead of 52. 5 elements instead of 4. A 5th element was added to fire, water, mirror, and silence. Memory. In the Andvale deck, memory was a single card. In the tournament deck, it's an entire suit. 10 numbered cards and 3 face cards. Memory allowed a player to reveal their opponent's discard pile. 1 memory card reveals 1 card from the discard pile. 2 memory cards in a row reveal the entire side of the discard pile. A memory master could reveal their opponent's entire hand in a single move. According to Complete Information, when Dan heard this, he froze. Complete information. In poker, there's nothing stronger. Knowing what your opponent is holding ends the game. The math becomes 100% certain. No unknowns, no probabilities, only the optimal move. But the opponent could also see his hand. Mirror-like transparency. When both know everything, the one who thinks 1 move ahead wins, or 4 moves ahead, like King Syros. Dan began building a model of the tournament deck from scratch. Sarah helped with the magical interactions, Una with the rules, Evelyn with the tactics. 4 days, 18 hours a day. By the start of the tournament, Dan had a model. Not complete, but functional. First round. An opponent from Merveille, a small house, a young arbiter with a copper ring. Nervous. Talented, but nervous. Dan won in 30 minutes. He didn't. He played steadily. He waited for a mistake. The mistake came on the 9th move. The young Arb played the memory master too early. He saw Dan's hand. He was frightened by what he saw, and he began to play out of fear. Dan finished him off gently. Second round, an opponent from Chason. Yuna on the platform turned pale when she saw the coat of arms. Her kingdom. The arbiter was a woman in her 40s with a stern gaze and a playing style as rough as chopping wood. Strong, fast, straightforward. The game lasted an hour. Dan was losing until the 12th move. Then he found a combination, a mirror of memory. He copied his master's move and used it against her, her own weapon. She saw it and smiled. The first person to smile at him at the table. Then she lost. She stood up. She held out her hand. Dan shook it, a firm hand. She said she'd remember that move. Round 3, the semifinals. And that's when Dan saw him. Cassian Vale, Lord Arbiter of Velmore, a first-rank ring, the face of King Cyros's school. He was sitting in the upper tier, watching the games, not playing, just watching. Standing next to him was Torvin, the very same one, a black cloak with silver embroidery. Cassian was exactly as Evelyn had described him, of average height, thin, a neat goatee, dark, calm eyes. The eyes of a man who sees a chessboard where others see a table. He was looking at Dan. Dan was looking at him. Across the entire hall, across the tiers and over the heads of the crowd. Their eyes met, and Dan realized one thing. Cassian wasn't angry. He didn't despise him. He wasn't afraid. He was studying him, like an entomologist studying a new species of beetle, with interest, with caution, with every intention of crushing him if necessary. The semifinals. His opponent was an arbiter from Velmore, not Cassian, another one. Young, strong, with a silver ring and a playing style that smacked of the Vale school. Steady, calculating, without any weaknesses. The game lasted 2 hours, the longest of Dan's life. His opponent was good, very good. He calculated, not like Dan, but he calculated. The Vale School taught calculation, not probabilities, moves, decision trees. If I do this, then he does that, then I do this. Dan calculated differently, not a tree, but a cloud. Not moves, but probabilities. Not what will happen, but what's more likely. The two approaches clashed at the table and sparked. By the middle of the game, the score was almost even. Dan was down by 3 points. A trifle, but a trifle that, in a long game, turns into a mountain. He looked at the tier. Cassian was watching, motionless. Evelyn was standing next to Dan. She leaned toward his ear and whispered a single word. Memory. Dan understood. He had a memory master on his hand. He'd been saving it, waiting for the right moment. But Evelyn saw what he hadn't. His opponent was waiting too. Waiting for Dan's memory master, preparing for it. He had an answer. So the memory master had to be used not for an attack, but for deception. Play it. See the opponent's hand, and make a move that contradicts what he saw. An irrational move, a move that doesn't follow from the information. Because the opponent will also see Dan's hand and build his response on logic. And Dan will respond illogically. In poker, this is called meta-play, playing not the cards, but the opponent's expectations of your opponent. He laid out the master of memory. He saw his opponent's hand. Strong, keeper of fire, 2 mirrors, herald of silence. His opponent had a killer combination. Dan's logical response was to defend. Silence. to fold, wait it out. That was exactly what his opponent was waiting for. Dan attacked with a trio of water, 3 points, small change. His opponent blinked. Attacking with a trio when your opponent has Firekeeper in their hand. Suicide. But Dan knew something his opponent didn't. A water trio after a memory master created a hidden effect. Fog. One of the 12 variables Sarah had taught him. Fog reduced the accuracy of the next face-up card by 3 points. The Firekeeper lost a third of its power. His opponent played the Firekeeper. He expected 20 points, but he got 13. His eyes widened. He didn't understand why. Dan understood, and that was enough. A 3-point lead, then 5, then 8. Slowly, drop by drop, like water wearing away a stone. By the final move, Dan was up by 11 points. Not much, but enough. The sphere went dark. The game was over. The semifinal was won. Dan was in the final. Cassian stood up from his seat. He turned around and walked away without waiting for the announcement. Dan watched his back and thought that this man already knew the outcome of the final, and that was frightening. The final was tomorrow. His opponent was a first-rank arbiter from Galvin, the local champion, a formidable player. Dan could win. He saw the odds, 60-40 in his favor. But winning meant earning the right to ask a question about the charter, a question that would pit him against Velmore openly, forever. And it meant that one day, Syros would sit across the table from him. He lay on the bed in the tavern and stared at the ceiling. His left hand was trembling. The final, the Palace of Rings. The central hall. The ceiling was so high it vanished into the shadows. 7 banners on the walls, 7 colors. A table in the center, carved from a single piece of moon silver. It glowed, quietly, steadily, like a breath. The stands were full, 1,000 people, maybe more. Arbiters, diplomats, merchants, aristocrats. In a separate box on the upper tier sat a man Dan had never seen before. But he recognized him, by the way everyone around him froze, by the way the air around the box seemed different, heavier, thicker. King Syros Orhane, Lord of Velmore, the man who hadn't lost a single game in 9 years. He sat quietly, motionless, staring down at the table. Cassian Vale stood beside him. Dan looked away. Not now. Syros wasn't his opponent today. Today, his opponent was Alton Galvis, a first-rank arbiter, the Galvena champion. 60 years old, a white beard, large, calm hands, eyes faded from having witnessed too many games. He had been playing at this table for 30 years. He knew every scratch on it, every glint of silver. This was his home, and Dan had come into his home. They sat down across from each other. The tournament director read the terms. The final of the 7 Rings tournament. The winner receives the right to vote before the council. The stake is symbolic. Honor. Alton looked at Dan calmly, like a grandfather watching his grandson about to do something foolish but brave. Then he nodded. And they began. Alton played differently than anyone Dan had ever faced. Not aggressively, not defensively, not cautiously. He played beautifully. Every move was like a brushstroke. The cards landed on the table not for points, but for form. Combination after combination, the elements intertwined. Fire and memory, mirror and silence, water and fire again. He was building something, not just racking up points. He was painting a picture. And Dan realized that Alton wasn't counting. He was feeling. But he was feeling with a depth that went beyond mathematics. Over 30 years at this table, he had absorbed the deck. It had become a part of him. He didn't know probability. He was probability. Dan was losing. 10 points. 20. 25. By the 10th hand, he was down 30 points and his model wasn't working. Not because it was wrong, but because Alton was playing outside the model. Every move he made was optimal. But not based on calculation, on something else. Dan sat at the table and, for the first time in this world, felt what he'd felt in Vegas when he'd faced a player who was simply better. Not smarter, not more cunning, just better. His left hand was trembling. Under the table, quietly, he was breathing, counting, breathing, counting. And then he looked back. Not at the cards, back at his team. Lyra was standing by the wall, her eyes wide, her hands clasped against her chest. Sarah was next to her notebook, sketching something quickly. Una stood with her back straight, staring at the table. Issa was in the corner, missing one glove. And Evelyn. Evelyn was standing right behind him, staring at Alton, at his hands, at his cards. And in her eyes, Dan saw something he'd never seen before. Excitement. Not fear, not anxiety. Excitement. She wanted to play. She was looking at the table and wanted to sit down. Dan made a decision. On the 13th move, he did something no one had ever done in the final of the Seven Rings tournament. He stood up. The hall fell silent. Alton looked up. The tournament director stepped forward. Dan turned to Evelyn. He looked her in the eyes and said 3 words. "Take my seat." The hall erupted in a roar. The tournament director began to say that this was impossible. Una shouted the paragraph number from the stands. Paragraph 31, Article 7. In a tournament match, a second-rank arbiter or higher has the right to be replaced if the replacement is a current or former arbiter of a rank no lower than that of the person being replaced. Evelyn Holt, a former first-rank arbiter. Technically, her ring had been taken away, but her rank had not been revoked. They'd stripped her of her ring, not her rank. Una knew this. Una had discovered this 3 months ago and had been waiting. She hadn't told Dan. She'd been waiting for the right moment. The administrator was checking the records. Una was right. She was always right. Evelyn stood motionless. Her hands hung at her sides. Dan could see her fingers trembling. 7 years. 7 years without a seat at the table. 7 years feeling broken. He didn't try to talk her into it. He didn't ask. He didn't pressure her. He simply stepped back and left the chair empty. Evelyn looked at the chair, at the deck, at Alton, who sat and waited with the same calmness with which he'd been waiting for 30 years. Then she sat down. Her hands rested on the table. The tremor subsided after 3 seconds, like morning fog. She picked up Dan's cards. She looked at them, and an expression appeared on her face that Dan had seen only once in his life, on the face of the dealer, Marcus, when he returned to the table after his heart attack. The expression of a man who had come home. The game continued. Evelyn was down 30 points. Dan's hands, his position, his loss. She had to pull him out of this hole. And she did. Not with math, not with cunning, with experience. Alton's 30 years against Evelyn's 22. His intuition against her memory. His charm against her precision. The game lasted another hour. Dan stood behind Evelyn and counted, quietly, to himself. And sometimes she would turn her head slightly, and he would whisper a number, a probability, a percentage, a single word. She would nod and make her move. They were playing as a team. His math and her hands. By the final moves, the score was almost even. Evelyn had made up 28 points out of 30. The difference was 2. 2 points. The last move. Evelyn had 1 card in her hand, the Keeper of Memory, the strongest card in the suit. It revealed everything, her entire hand, all the discards, everything. But Alton also had 1 card, the Unknown. Evelyn could play the Keeper, see his card, and calculate. Or she could take a risk. She looked at Dan. He shook his head. Don't calculate, not on this turn. Play. She turned back to the table. She laid down the Memory Keeper, face up, without activating it. She forewent the card's power. She used only its numerical value, 12 points. Pure, no magic, no tricks. Alton laid down his card, Master of Fire, 14 points. He won. 2 points. The room exhaled. Evelyn lost. Dan lost. The final was lost. But Alton didn't celebrate. He sat there, staring at the Memory Keeper lying face up, unactivated. And slowly, he realized what Evelyn had done. She could have activated the Memory Keeper, seen his card, found out he had the Fire Master, and played differently. But she didn't. She played fair, blindly, against the strongest opponent, and lost by 2 points. Alton stood up. He reached across the table, not toward Dan, toward Evelyn. She shook his hand. He said that in 30 years this had been the best final game and that he was sorry she hadn't played all those 7 years. Evelyn didn't reply. She simply stood up, steadily, calmly. Her hands didn't tremble. She turned to Dan, and he saw that there was no more fatigue in her green eyes. She sat down at the table. She played. She lost. And she didn't break. The audience began to disperse. Dan stood by the table. He had lost the final. He hadn't earned the right to vote. He didn't ask the question about the charter. The plan hadn't worked. But he'd done something else. He'd brought Evelyn back. It was worth the final. Syros watched him from the upper tier, silently, for a long time. Then he stood up and left. But Cassian Vale stayed. He went downstairs. He approached Dan. He looked at him up close for the first time, and he said quietly that Dan was an interesting man, that he had lost the final so that a woman could feel alive again, and that this made him either noble or foolish, and that the line between those two things in Cartana was very thin. Then he added that King Syros wanted to see him, in a year, at the table, and that this was not a request. Dan stood there and looked him in the eyes, calm, dark, the eyes of an entomologist. Then he nodded. In a year, at the table. Cassian left. A year. A whole year. Dan spent it just as he would have spent preparing for the most important game of his life, because that's exactly what it was. He returned to Andvale. He worked. He played. He taught. Over the course of that year, something that hadn't existed before took shape around him. A school. Not a building with desks. A living school, made up of people who came to him and said, "Teach me to count." A fisherman from the cove whom he had saved. A young merchant from Galvena who had witnessed the semifinals. A former student of Altina's who had walked all the way to Andvale after the finals. 9 people. Dan taught them probability, conditional probabilities, Bayesian corrections. Sarah taught them to see hidden effects. Una taught the rules. Evelyn taught them to read people. Isa taught them to spot deception. It wasn't an army. It was a seed. A tiny seed planted in the soil of a continent that had been deciding everything at the card table for 800 years, but had never learned to count. Meanwhile, Dan was wrapping up his business. Sarah led him to the debt tower. He challenged the official who held her father's tag to a game. The official sent a player, an average player, a bronze ring. Dan won in 20 minutes. Sarah's father left the tower that same evening, thin, aged, with the hands of a calligrapher, trembling from 8 months without a brush. Sarah stood at the gate and waited. When he came out, she didn't run to him. She bowed, deeply, like a student to a master. He placed his hand on her head, and they stood like that for a minute. Dan watched and thought of his sister, to whom he hadn't finished writing a letter. Una had also received hers. Through a chain of games, complex ones, multi-move ones. Dan played 3 of them personally. Evelyn played 1. The first one after the tournament. She won, cleanly, confidently, without a tremor. The result was a diplomatic revision of the trade agreement between Velmore and Chasson. Una's father was granted freedom of movement. Not complete freedom, but the gates of home were opened. Una wrote him a letter, her first in a year and a half. She cried as she wrote, quietly, with her back straight. Even her tears flowed neatly. Isa. Dan sat her down at the table in her 8th month. An honest game, a small wager, 20 silver coins. She sat at the table without gloves, both hands bare, her fingers calloused from thousands of fake shuffles. She played honestly, for the first time in her life. She won. She stood up from the table, looked at her hands, and said they felt strangely light. Erin, Princess of the House of Mervale. Dan learned about her through Evelyn, 20 years old, fair-haired, gentle, with a straight back that was not discipline, but armor. She was being married off. Across the table, a draconian marriage contract forced through by Velmore. The groom was twice her age, the heir to a neighboring kingdom, an ally of Saros. Dan traveled to Mervale, alone, without a team. He sat down at the table across from the arbitrator, who represented the groom's side. A silver ring, a tough player. The stake wasn't the princess's freedom at all. Dan knew that completely annulling the contract was impossible. Too much politics, too many obligations between the houses. Instead, he staked a specific right. Erin's right to choose her own husband. And a deadline. 5 years to decide. The match lasted 3 hours. The groom's arbiter played dirty. Not dishonestly, but dirty. He applied emotional pressure. He threw out phrases about the honor of the house, about blood duty, about how a girl without a husband was a disgrace. Dan didn't hear any of it. He heard only numbers, and the numbers said he had 63%. He won. The scroll was signed. Erin stood in the hall, silent, in a dress in the colors of her house, blue and silver. She looked at the scroll, then at Dan. Then, for the first time in her life, she poured herself some wine, from the decanter sitting on the guest table, by herself, without permission, without a bow. She simply took it and poured. Her hand didn't tremble. She drank, set the glass down, and said thank you. Dan nodded and left. Erin remained at her home. But a week later, a letter arrived. Neat handwriting, thin paper. She wrote that for the first time in her life, she'd woken up one morning and thought about what she herself wanted. Not what her father wanted, not what the family wanted, but what she wanted. And that it was a strange feeling, like walking barefoot after wearing shoes her whole life. A year had passed, and here he was, Velmore, the capital, King Siros's throne room for the party. Huge. Black marble columns, the ceiling painted in gold, and in the center, a table, not silver, gold. The deck of cards on it glistened. Dan entered the hall and stopped. One man sat at the table, Siros Orhane. Short, thin, a narrow face, light eyes, almost transparent. He was looking at Dan, and Dan felt his gaze pass right through him. Not a metaphor. A sensation. as if you'd been X-rayed. Siros saw. Not the cards, not the hands. He saw the branches of the future, possibilities, outcomes. He looked at Dan and saw every possible version of what would happen at the table. Standing next to Siros was Cassian Vale, acting as the game master. His face was stony. Behind Dan stood his team, all of them. Lyra, Sarah, Evelyn, Una, Issa. Aaron sat in the guest box on the upper tier, dressed in blue and silver. The game master announced the stakes. If Siros won, Dan would sign away his claim to the ring and leave the game for good. If Dan Siros won, he would agree to a revision of the Charter of the Cards of Consent. Dan sat down. The deck lay between them, golden, warm, alive. It hummed louder than any deck he'd ever held, like a choir, like a heartbeat. The game began. Saros played, and Dan understood everything within the first 3 moves. The math didn't work, not against this man. Saros had already seen every move Dan would make, every combination, every plan. He wasn't just responding. He was responding to what Dan was going to do 2 moves from now. Foresight, true foresight, not reading micro-expressions, not calculating probabilities. Vision, a gift, a miracle of one man. By the 10th move, Dan was down 40 points. A disaster. The room was silent. Lyra pressed her hands to her chest. Sarah wasn't drawing. Evelyn stood motionless. Only Issa, in the corner, quietly slipped off her second glove. Dan sat at the table and knew he would lose. Mathematics would lose. His mathematics against his gift. Earthly statistics against 400-year-old magic. And then he stopped counting. For the first time in his life, he looked at his cards and didn't calculate the probabilities. He didn't build a model. He didn't make any predictions. He looked at Evelyn over his shoulder, at Lyra by the wall, at Sarah with her notebook, at Una standing with her back straight, at Issa without her gloves, at Aaron on the balcony, and he made a bet that in any probability model was suicide. He laid out all his remaining cards, all at once. He broke the rhythm. He broke the logic. He broke everything he'd built for himself over the past year and a half in this world. Siros saw it in every branch of the future. A suicidal bet. In every branch, it led to defeat. He went all in. And then Evelyn did something that hadn't happened in a single branch. She pulled an old ring out of her pocket, her own, first rank, the one that had been taken from her 7 years ago, the one she'd kept all this time, carried with her every day, as a reminder, like a scar. She placed it on the table, next to the deck. Una from the gallery recited the rule. Paragraph 9, Article 1 of the ancient edition of the Charter. A ring voluntarily returned to the game by its former owner obligates the game master to recalculate the bets for the hand. A defunct provision, unused for 3 centuries, but not repealed. Una had checked. 300 years ago, someone had written this rule into the code, and it had lain there like a sleeping mine, waiting. 300 years, waiting for this moment. Cassian turned pale. He knew the rules, all the rules, but not this one, not a dormant provision. He looked at the ring on the table, then at Una, then at the codex, and slowly nodded. Recalculation of bets. That meant Siros's all-in was being recalculated under new terms. His bet was ballooning. His risk was tripling. And so were his branches of the future. All the branches he could see no longer led to victory. Because in none of them was Evelyn's ring. In none of the branches of the future did Siros see a woman who had carried a dead ring in her pocket for 7 years, waiting for the moment to place it on the table. Because foresight sees the probable, and what Evelyn had done was improbable. Syros looked at the table, at the ring, at the cards, at the bets that had been tallied. For the first time in 9 years, he saw a branch he hadn't foreseen. He silently laid down the cards. He didn't give up. He put them aside, like a chess game that could be resumed. The room held its breath. Syros looked up at Dan, and he spoke quietly so that only the two of them and Cassian could hear. He said that if that was the case, then he really had been sent, and that, in that case, she should sit across from him again. In a year. Then he stood up and left. The throne room emptied slowly. Cassian picked up Evelyn's ring from the table, carefully, as proof, or as a relic. Dan sat at the table. He didn't move. His left hand rested on his knee. It was trembling, slightly, intensely. For the first time in a long time, the tremor came not from fear, but from something else. From the fact that he had just looked into the eyes of a man who could see the future and hadn't looked away. Lyra walked over. She placed her hand on his shoulder, warm, heavy, real. Dan covered her hand with his own, trembling. They stood there in silence. Then Sarah walked over. She stood beside them. She opened her notebook and wrote down a new word. Gambit. She drew a chess knight next to it. Una bowed to the table. Isa stood without gloves, staring at her hands. Clean. Free. Hands that hadn't cheated or fought today. They simply were. Evelyn was the last to approach, without her ring. Again. She'd given it away, placed it on the table, and lost it for the second time. But her expression was different, not like 7 years ago when it had been taken from her. Now she'd given it away herself, and it was a completely different feeling. She looked at Dan and said the tea was getting cold. They left the throne room, the 6 of them, down the hallway, past the columns, past the guards, past the Velmore coats of arms on the walls, through the main gates and out onto the street. The evening air smelled of smoke and something sweet. The capital of Velmore was buzzing. Music was playing somewhere. People were arguing somewhere. Somewhere at a table, someone's fate was being decided by silver cards. Dan walked along the cobblestones and thought. He hadn't won. He hadn't lost. The game was postponed. Syros had said in a year. So, in a year. Back to the table. Back to the cards. Once again, the branches of the future pitted against earthly mathematics. But now Dan knew one thing. Mathematics alone would not defeat Syros. No single person could defeat him, no matter how intelligent they might be. Syros would be defeated by something he cannot. People who do the impossible. Not because it's profitable, but because it's the right thing to do. Evelyn placed the ring not out of calculation. She placed it because she believed. Not in the goddess of luck, not in a normal distribution. In Dan. In the table. In the fact that the cards can decide fairly if fair people are sitting at the table. It was irrational. It was beautiful. And it shattered the prophecy. Dan walked and counted. Not the cards, the steps. His people nearby. 6 pairs of feet on the cobblestones. 6 people, each with pain that the table can heal. And 9 students in Andwheel who are learning to count. And the fishermen in the cove who are catching fish. And Erin in Mervelt pouring herself some wine. And Sarah's father holding a paintbrush again. And somewhere on the continent, Lyra's sister. The buyer's name is now known because Dan won that name in a game 2 months ago. And Lyra knows where to go. He touched the tag on his wrist. Debtor. It was still there. An ancient debt. 300 years. the contract by which his soul was pulled from the world of numbers into the world of cards. Who had summoned him? He knew now. Not Syros, not Cassian, not a human at all. The deck. The deck itself. The last living guardian of the original cards of consent, the one who had waited 300 years for the arrival of the one who could calculate better than he could believe. Dan hadn't seen her, he hadn't spoken to her, but he could feel her every time he took the cards in his hands. A hum, a pulse, warmth. The deck was breathing, and she was waiting, not for Syros's downfall, not for Dan's victory. She was waiting to be repaired. The system that had kept the world from war for 800 years and was now cracking because one man with a gift had proven stronger than the rules. Dan wasn't here to win. He was here to fix things. Just like in Vegas. When a loophole appeared at the table, he'd close it. He didn't play. He fixed it. He's not a gambler. He's an architect. And in a year, he'll sit down at the table again. Not alone, with a team, with students, with people who know how to count and know how to believe, with people who do the impossible. And they'll rewrite the rules, not for themselves, for everyone, so that math and hard work and teamwork mean more than the miracle of a single genius. Lyra walked beside him. Her hand accidentally brushed against his. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. They walked through the evening streets of Velmore, the 6 of them, and ahead lay a year, and a table, and cards, and everything else.